Opening credits. Daddy's Home. A Ghost Paranormal Military Romance. By Summer Cooper. Auto-narrated using Google technology. Chapter 1. Zebediah Resnake entered the tent and went over to his cot. Laying on his bed were 2 letters. Cherokee Joe had picked up the mail, he noted, as he reached down and picked up the letters. He instantly recognized the handwriting on one from his mother. The other, he knew as he opened it, was from his new wife, Mary. He lowered himself down to the cot as he read. Mary poured her heart out in the letter. Her love and adoration for him etched into every sentence. She was desperate for him to return home to her and the baby she was expecting any time now. They had been married just 6 months before Zebediah had been shipped off to this godforsaken place in Vietnam. It was only 4 a.m., but already the heat was rising for another scorcher of a day. Zebediah bundled the letters into a plastic sleeve and slipped that into his inside pocket. Slinging his webbing onto his shoulder and picking up his rifle, he made his way outside to join the rest of the crew. He was part of a long-range recon group, and today they were headed back into the jungle. Lieutenant Bill Simpson counted his 5 men into the awaiting chopper, slapping each one on the back as they ascended into the cramped seats past the gunner. Cherokee Joe hauled his machine gun up in front of him, as if it were a child's toy. He was a huge man, at least 6'6" tall and wide across. He smiled over at Zebediah. "Got you some mail from that pretty wife of yours, right, Razor?" he said. "Sure did. Thanks, Joe. One from my ma too, it looks like. I'll have something to read on the trip at least." He laughed. Cherokee Joe smiled back, and the 6 of them dropped into silence as the chopper rotors increased speed and they slowly lifted off. Looking from the open doorway, Zebediah noted the second chopper that would accompany them. Both helicopters would play hopscotch through clearings in the jungle. As one would pretend to land, the other would zoom ahead, and further on would itself appear to land. This would keep the Viet Cong from knowing exactly where the insertion point of the recon group would be. They'd know it was somewhere and would be out hunting them, but at least this method bought the team some time to get into the depths of the jungle and under cover. Everyone in the team had been chosen because they were skilled in something of use to the team. Cherokee Joe, huge as he was a natural tracker. He could pick out the path of a snail that might have gone through a week ago. He knew what was edible and what was poisonous, what water could be drunk, and what would send them into agonizing stomach cramps and a case of the runs. Hunting Charlie was an easy task for this man, and though he rarely smiled, he was always happiest out here in the jungle. Lieutenant Simpson was an old hand in jungle warfare too. He was a natural leader of small, crack teams like this, and his priority was always getting his men home. As the helicopter soared over the treetops, he pored over the map on his knee. They were headed for an old French fort. Intelligence reports suggested some activity in that area, and Lieutenant Simpson and his men would quietly move in and confirm or deny Viet Cong there. No need to engage the enemy. No drama. Just get close enough to make notes and get out. They'd be inserted 5 miles from the fort, and would be extracted a few miles further from that point. Simple and short. Just like every other simple and short recon, they went on, thought Lieutenant Simpson, as the chopper dropped into a large clearing. He knew this wasn't their drop-off, just a decoy, so he carried on examining the map. Jethro Mullen sat fiddling with his radio. He constantly wiped at it with a dirty green rag. It was his pride and joy. As the radio operator, he was a key part of any mission. Communication back to base could call in an airstrike and artillery barrage, and of course an evacuation anywhere and anytime. Just so long as his beloved radio stayed operational. Wherever they ended up, Jethro Mullen was their link to home. He smiled to himself as he hummed a pretty new Rolling Stones song and gazed around the chopper at the other faces. All were coated in camouflage cream and stubble, broken only by gleaming eyeballs and shining teeth. He knew these were the guys that would get him and his radio home again. A look back from the co-pilot and a nod confirmed to Lieutenant Simpson the drop zone was coming up, and this one was the proper job. He slapped Cherokee Joe's knee and nodded. The signal passed around the cramped cabin, and the team were switched to combat mode. All the daydreams and sleepiness got put to one side as they mentally prepared to disembark. The chopper swooped low into a clearing and hovered 10 feet above the ground. One by one they leapt out of the chopper and zigzagged across the clearing into the cover of the trees beyond. The whole operation had taken only a couple of minutes, and all 6 men safely melted into the security of the jungle. The chopper lifted off and sped into the air, closely followed by its companion. They would make a few more dummy runs before returning to base. Dawn was breaking as the small team gathered together in a small hollow under the canopy of the huge trees. Here Lieutenant Simpson showed them all the map and outlined the mission. They set off towards the target with Zebediah taking point. Progress was slow through the thick jungle. It always was, and they were all aware of the fact that getting there was about a state of mind more than anything else. Just keeping moving in the right direction was more important than breaking a speed record. Feeling too hot already, the air was starting to steam as the sun rose. This was a journey through a sauna with the addition of leeches, snakes, and an enemy waiting potentially around every tree. Taking it calm and taking it slow mattered. A man could easily lose his mind in here. Zebediah edged his way into the dense jungle, followed by Lieutenant Simpson. For Zebediah, the only real difference to tracking through this jungle and his home in West Virginia was the type of trees and, of course, the quarry he was hunting. But he understood how nature worked the same way the world over. It was the parts that weren't natural that he needed to be aware of. He had been brought up to hunt through the forests and mountains with his father. They would spend a couple of days out hunting for the deer that would keep the family fed for a good while. Perhaps a couple of squirrel to fill the pot, and if they struck luck at the right time of year, a brace of wild turkey. Keeping a low profile in that situation was just as important as now, and his father still kept himself a moonshine up there. Well hidden, he would bring Zebediah up to check on it regularly. Unlike the deer and squirrels, the revenue men wouldn't be running in the other direction if they were found out. Another reason for Zebediah to learn the art of keeping a low profile and silent movements from a young age. The moonshine brought in a little bit of much-needed income, but to be caught was a price they could never afford. Without his father, or even without Zebediah, the family would have struggled to survive in their isolated homestead. His feet edged and poked forward carefully as they moved deeper into the thick, steaming jungle. The group had been moving for about an hour when Zebediah waved them down to a halt and motioned for Lieutenant Simpson to come forward. They were approaching a track. To ordinary folk, this would have looked perhaps like an animal may have moved through at some earlier date, but to Zebediah and Lieutenant Simpson it could have been a 4-lane freeway. Lieutenant Simpson moved back and got the group together as he reached for his map. He pointed out the area and noted the path on his map. Obviously the Viet Cong had been moving through here and recently. The track led in the right direction to the old French fort. A good indication the intelligence had been right. They would follow the track, but stay in the cover of the jungle and move parallel to it. There was a good chance the track had been booby-trapped, and the Vietnamese would soon know if an enemy patrol had been on it. They had nothing but contempt for the way the Westerners crashed through the jungle like buffalo. To the Vietnamese, they smelled as bad as buffalo too. Following the track then wasn't an option. Lieutenant Simpson and his recon team weren't your ordinary Westerners. They knew their stuff too. Jim Harrison took point as they moved on towards the fort. Jim was short, dark, much like Gregory Mason, the man behind him from Kentucky. Zebediah fell back to the rear with Cherokee Joe ahead of him, frowning as he scoured the dense jungle with the machine gun. They moved along in silence, absorbed in the moment and alert to the slightest movement around them. The sun was high and steamed down through the tree canopy, almost blinding them with the moisture. The sun itself was shrouded in a blanket of steam that hung below the treetops. By midday, Lieutenant Simpson called a halt, and they grouped defensively in a cluster of tree roots. Here they would take a break from the heat and Lieutenant Simpson and Jim Harrison would take a look at the fort. For now, the rest of the team could enjoy a watchful halt in the safety of their tree roots. Zebediah took the letters from his pocket and opened the one from his wife, Mary. Mary was missing him, it read. Missing his muscular arms around her. Missing running her hands through his thick mop of blonde hair. Though he was so far away, she slept with his shirt beside her every night and felt him close to her. The baby inside her was kicking and restless to be born. That would be soon. Then both Mary and their baby would be waiting for Daddy to come home. That was all Mary wanted. Her husband and father of their child home and safe again. Back in their secluded mountain homestead. Away from the problems the world seemed eager to chase day after day. A world they didn't need because all they needed was each other, and this little place called home. Zebediah wiped a tear from his eye as he read. He could see Cherokee Joe staring at him, and made as if he was wiping sweat from his brow. Joe gave a knowing and rare smile and nodded, looking away. Zebediah replaced the letter in his jacket pocket carefully, and started to give his rifle some attention with a cloth from his trouser pocket. Focus on the moment was all he needed. Home was a long way away, and to get there, he would need to stay focused on the job in hand. Simple. Stay focused, Zebediah, he told himself. Lieutenant Simpson returned from his first foray with Jim Harrison. He pulled the group into him, and using the map explained what they had found at the fort. The fort itself was still an empty ruin, but not far from it, and not far from where they were sat, the Viet Cong had moved in 2 artillery pieces. There were at least 50 Viet Cong in and around the guns too. Lieutenant Simpson was pretty sure that the track they had shadowed was probably patrolled, and that moving out now was a bad idea. He pointed towards the sky, or at least the bit of it they could see through the thick tree canopy. He determined they would wait for the approaching rainstorm before they left. The torrential rain would keep any noise they made hidden, and keep the guards' heads down some as the recon group made its exit. Lieutenant Simpson took the headset from Jethro Mullen and reported their position and what he had found. He suggested an airstrike or artillery strike on the fort and surrounding area soonest. With the coming downpour, he thought a combination of the weather and an artillery barrage would cause enough distress to allow him and his team to leave the area and meet their extraction chopper. He was less than happy with the response from HQ. Although he had crawled up there himself and numbered the enemy units, headquarters were still convinced there was nothing of any importance there. They told Lieutenant Simpson they would note his report and send in a couple of tanks with a platoon of infantry the next day, and not to worry over it. Have a safe trip back to the extraction point, but thank you for the effort. He threw the headset back at Jethro in disgust and growled. I waste my freaking time with these cowboys. One day, I'm going to drag one of those useless bastards out here, and let them see firsthand the shit we go through to get this shit done. Okay, we wait for the rain and bug out for the ride home. No artillery coming. Eff'em, we did our bit. The rain came. There wasn't any doubt it was going to come. Rain at this time of year came like clockwork every afternoon. The skies just got so hot and loaded with the moisture it had no choice but to drop it all back down again in a huge deluge. Within a minute of the rain starting, the whole area changed. Winding breaks between the tall tree roots turned to small rivers of brown mud. Visibility through the rain was negligible, and the trick was just to worry about keeping the man ahead in sight. Zebediah had taken point with Lieutenant Simpson not too far behind, confirming the route through the torrential downpour. He was of course right about the noise. The crash and hiss of the rain hammering down would have drowned out a division of tanks moving through this part of the jungle. They followed the track they had found on the way in, and staying parallel to it again made a couple of miles progress. They stopped for a break in a well-hidden gap and hunkered down against the rain. Lieutenant Simpson got back on the radio and called in for their chopper. They didn't have too far to go, but he didn't want them exposing the pickup by being too close if someone had managed to shadow them. Timing was everything, so a wait here would make a quick extraction easier and safer. Zebediah opened the second letter from his mother. He knew it would be maybe half an hour before they moved again. His mother's letter had obviously followed a week or two after that of his wife Mary, though he had received them together. She was not happy. Mary was not the good woman Zebediah thought she was. She was rude to her, always snapping at her about how things needed to be done. She wouldn't have got away with talking to Zebediah's father like that, she noted. He would have taken a switch to the sassy madam. Sadly, Zebediah's father had passed some years ago, and Zebediah had taken on the role of man of the homestead. Zebediah missed his pa. Missed him bad. He had been everything Zebediah wanted to be. He continued reading. Apparently Mary had been going into town almost as soon as Zebediah had left. She was getting something of a reputation. Coming home late, and having strange men drop her off at the bottom of the track. This wasn't the girl Zebediah deserved, she thought. She didn't even believe the baby was his. She was sorry she had to write him such a terrible letter, but some things needed saying. She hoped he would stay safe and out of harm's way. She couldn't wait for him to get home and sort out his wayward wife. Zebediah folded the letter and returned it to his jacket pocket as he started to feel that the world had just turned into a place he didn't know. He loved his mother. She was a true mountain woman and had no fear of anything in those hills. The only thing she feared was for son. Protecting him from the world and the evils that came from the town was all she cared about. She had taken to Mary at first and was pleased they had married, Zebediah remembered. She had welcomed Mary into the home and had done her best to make Mary feel the woman of the house now they were married. She wouldn't be writing this sort of thing if there wasn't some truth in it, Zebediah thought. She wouldn't have written it if she hadn't thought long and hard before she put that letter in the mail, knowing where he was. He trusted his mother. He thought he trusted Mary. His head whirled at the confusion of it all. Okay, we need to make this quick and quiet. Razor, take point, I'll be right behind you. Lieutenant Simpson whispered. In a mental fog, Zebediah made his way to the front of the group and set off towards their extraction point. The rain was still beating down, as they splashed between gaps in the trees and waded through stretches that just a few hours ago had been dry land. It became impossible to follow the man in front, and each man felt for his own route through the mire and roots. They had left the track they had found about a mile behind them, and were now less than half a mile from the pickup point. If the chopper arrived on time and in the right place, they would be home for dinner. Shit. Mine? Hissed Jethro from the middle of the group. They all heard and they all froze. Where? Cherokee Joe whispered. Under my foot, man, I'm standing on the freaking thing. Jethro whispered. Keep it cool, my friend. Just keep it nice and cool. We can fix this thing okay. Jethro just got to keep his shit together and let Joe do his thing, right? Cherokee Joe said, kneeling down alongside Jethro. The rest of the group had moved into fire positions around Jethro and Cherokee Joe, scanning through the rain for any signs of the enemy that may have planted the anti-personnel mine. Cherokee Joe slid a large hunting knife out of its sheath, taped to his webbing. He looked up at Jethro. Gonna slide this under your boot, nice and easy, friend. You keep the pressure on till I tell you otherwise, okay? Joe said. You got this, Joe? Lieutenant Simpson asked as he sidled alongside the huge man. He's got the radio, boss. Can't stand the guy, to be honest. He snores like bison on heat. But he's got the radio and we need that, right? Yeah, I got it if he does what Joe says. Cherokee Joe replied. Lieutenant Simpson moved out of the way and into a covering position. Boss of the team he may be, but for now he had to let the big man do his job and provide cover. Cherokee Joe slid the knife across the top of the mine and pressed down hard. His huge bulk easily replacing that of Jethro and his radio. Okay, jump. Joe snapped, and Jethro leaped backwards from the mine and landed ungracefully on the radio set. He looked down at his legs and patted them. Both still there, he noted, as he rolled painfully away from the mine and Joe. Okay, someone drag me that big rock and sit it on the knife. Joe said, pointing with his head to a huge boulder some feet away from him. Zebediah slung his rifle and heaved up the huge rock, carrying it over to Cherokee Joe. "You screw this up, man, and we both get spread around this damn jungle. Nice and steady, just lower it easy like onto the knife. No sudden moves. We all going home for dinner today," Joe said. Zebediah gently lowered the huge stone down, towards the knife and the mine. Zebediah was no weakling either at 6 foot and well built, but this was one heavy rock he was trying to lower onto the mine like a sleeping baby. This could all go horribly wrong very quickly, he thought. He felt the rock as it
censored
the knife below it, and pausing briefly to look at Joe, who nodded. He continued to lower it onto the mine. As he did, Cherokee Joe slid the knife from under it and rolled to one side. Zebediah felt the rock had settled over the mine and slowly released, then quickly jumped face down into the dirt. "Grenade!" Jim Harrison yelled, returning fire to where 2 Viet Cong had emerged from the undergrowth and lobbed a hand grenade. Lieutenant Simpson lobbed one of his grenades back at the 2 men, and it exploded on target, killing one of the Viet Cong. The incoming grenade had landed at the feet of Jethro Mullen and exploded almost beneath him as he tried to stand and run. The radio had kept him pinned to the ground as he struggled to escape. Zebediah dived towards him, and ripping the radio from his back, tried to haul Jethro into cover. As he stood above the dying man, he felt the sizzle of a bullet slicing past his head. His attempts to duck were of no use, as the bullet had already entered the back of his head and exited at the front, slicing its way down the side. He looked down at the now still body of Jethro Mullen, as he felt his knees slowly giving way beneath him. He collapsed onto the dead man, and the dark red piece descended over his eyes as he fell into unconsciousness. The last thing he could remember was the strong hands of Cherokee Joe, hauling at his webbing. "I got you, Razor Man. We gonna get you home. It's all cool." Zebediah fell into unconsciousness, and was unaware of the efforts to get him back to the awaiting chopper. He never felt his body lifted onto the huge man's shoulders, as he carried him the last part of the journey. Lieutenant Simpson had charged at the remaining Viet Cong soldier in a rage. He wasn't prepared to lose men, and Jethro's death was one more than he was prepared to give. He blasted into the undergrowth and smashed his rifle into the enemy's face, pumping it over and over into a crushed and destroyed skull. Jim Harrison laid a hand on his shoulder and eased him away from the now lifeless corpse. Lieutenant Simpson shrugged off the hand but stopped. He turned to see Cherokee Joe with Zebediah on his back and the still body of Jethro on the ground. He turned back to the corpse and spat on what was left of the head. "Let's get the F out of here, Joe. We're done with this shit," he snarled. They made their way cautiously to the extraction point, knowing that the explosions and shooting would bring in more troops to hunt them down. But right on cue, as they emerged into the clearing, the chopper swooped down to pick them up. They loaded the unconscious Zebediah on first with the care of a newborn, then one by one somberly climbed aboard. This had not been the straightforward mission they had been told it would be. But none of them ever were. Chapter 2. It was several days before Zebediah slowly recovered consciousness. Even as he opened his eyes in the dimly lit medical unit, he felt the searing pain of bright lights hitting his retinas. It wasn't bright at all, but after so long in the dark it was painful. As his eyes slowly adjusted, he began to feel the parts of his body rejoining him bit by bit. His leg and shoulder were screaming in pain, and his head gave a constant dull thud. Through his blurred sight, he saw a shadow approaching over the top of him. He welcomed the shade on his eyes, but panicked at the thought of someone above him he couldn't identify. "You're awake. Well done. Take it easy and I'll fetch you something for the pain," a soothing voice said from the shadow. The nurse, at least Zebediah assumed it was a nurse, did some fiddling with his pillows and the bed, and gently took a hold of his wrist for a minute before departing. "Where am I?" Zebediah asked to the retreating shadow. "Safe and in good hands. Relax. Let me get you something for the pain," the departing voice said, and left Zebediah alone to confront the pain and adjust to the harsh light once again. The nurse returned, and without comment gave Zebediah an injection and left. He could feel the surge of morphine easing through him, and he slowly lost touch with the agonizing pain of his leg and shoulder. His eyes slowly adjusted to the light, and he turned his head gingerly to the side. Sitting beside his bed was Cherokee Joe. Cherokee Joe smiled and nodded. "Good to see you back in the land of the living, Razor. We thought we might have lost you for a while back there," Cherokee Joe said. "And the others?" "I seem to remember Jethro getting hit. There was a grenade," Zebediah replied. "Jethro bought it, sorry. The grenade took him out, and the blast shook that rock off the mine. That's what hit you after the bullet. The rock shattered and smashed you up pretty bad, my friend. But we got you back to the chopper. They went and picked Jethro up next day. Well, at least what was left of him, sorry," Cherokee Joe said. Zebediah turned his head away, and the memory of the incident flooded back. He flinched as he felt the bullet hitting his head. He couldn't remember the rock smashing into his unconscious body, but he could certainly feel the damage it had done now. "Ah, Resnake, good to see you up and about." Perhaps I should say Sergeant Resnake," came the barking voice of Lieutenant Simpson. He had made his way into the room, and up to the side of the bed clutching something in his hand. He tossed them on the bed. A set of sergeant chevrons. "Sergeant? What's that all about?" Zebediah asked Cherokee Joe. "Lieutenant's been out causing trouble upstairs, my friend. Wasn't happy about having his efforts ignored and losing a man. You're going home, Razor. He wanted to make sure you had a decent pension once you got back home to your new wife. Sergeant should help you put your life back together, he thinks," Cherokee Joe said. "Got me some too. Not sure I plan on letting it change my day though." "Going home? Why going home?" "I got another 2 years. I thought they'd fix me up and I'd be back with you guys," Zebediah replied. Lieutenant Simpson moved back towards the bed. "Home, son. You've done your bit here. Those injuries are going to need time to heal. Heal a lot better in the comfort of your wife's arms in your own home. Anyway, they need the beds here, and now you're awake, you're just taking up space and rations. Give our love to your wife, right? Mary, isn't it?" Zebediah nodded and winced as he felt the thud from his head. "I guess maybe you're right. Be good to see Mary again." "Okay, Joe, let's leave the wounded hero to get some rest. We're off out early in the morning, so best you buy me a beer or two now before we go," Lieutenant Simpson said, slapping Cherokee Joe on the shoulder and heading for the door. Cherokee Joe turned to Zebediah. "We shall be back to see you before you leave. Enjoy getting waited on here for now." Zebediah raised his good arm to wave goodbye and closed his eyes as he saw them leave. Home. Charles Station was situated high in the mountains and forests of West Virginia. The little town had grown slowly as people passed through the region on their way to other places. Few stopped. There was little to stop for back then. The gold was way west and the wealthy were in the north and east. Until they came for the coal, there was little to keep a man here looking to make his fortune. The people in Charles Station had been left and ignored for a good few generations to enjoy the deer hunting, the fresh spring waters, and whatever a man could grow for his family in the fertile earth. It had everything a man could want to survive, but nothing of what a modern man would want to live. Zebediah loved it. He loved the isolation of his small holding. His father had built it with his own hands. A few pigs and chickens and a garden kept the young Zebediah fed, and the well of pure spring water kept him watered. He had inherited it when his father died. Looking after his mother was his only concern until he had married Mary. Now, as he lay in this military hospital bed, Mary would be taking on his role of looking after mother. He knew she would rise to the challenge, and everything would be just as it should be once he returned home. Mary was beautiful. Long blonde hair framed her sweet pale Irish face and sparkling emerald eyes. Her slim body had been honed to perfection on those mountains. Swimming in ice-cold creeks in hot summers, and eating food that had never been near a store. Yes, she was beautiful. Through closed eyes, Zebediah thought back to the days before he had to leave his beloved Mary. They'd met at church, Zebediah's natural shyness with women giving way to Mary's beauty. He had to speak to the beautiful young woman. He had to know the woman with the beautiful green eyes. They'd spent months walking back and forth to the other's house, getting to know each other, stealing.
Censored.
In the dark woods when Zebediah would walk her home. He'd asked her to marry him, and they'd planned a typical mountain wedding, but the U.S. Army had gotten in the way. Not even out of his teens, and he'd been ordered to go fight for his country. He'd received his draft card, and that had put a halt to their plans. They'd gotten married before Zebediah had to ship out for his training, spending the night in a cheap hotel as their honeymoon. Zebediah hadn't cared about the squeaky bed or the weird smell of cigarettes in the room when Mary walked out of the bathroom in her silky white gown, her hair down and her eyes shy. Mary had been a virgin, but so had Zebediah.
This scene has been censored to provide a safe and enjoyable reading experience for everyone.
Zebediah loosened the ties of the gown at her shoulders, and the silky material pulled at her knees. He remembered gazing at her.
Censored.
Pale flesh, her high round.
Censored.
Tipped with rose-colored.
Censored.
And her trim waist, leading to a small triangle of blonde hair. "You're breathtaking," he'd whispered as she looked at him expectantly. His mind played through the scenes, taking him from the pain and grief of the moment to a time when he'd been the happiest. His Mary crying out in pleasure beneath him, or eagerly pulling him down to the creek behind the house to get on her knees and take him in her mouth. He and Mary had done things together he'd never dreamed of, things he didn't even know you could do, and Mary eagerly took part in those things with him. But the one scene that replayed the most in his mind was that first time Mary had exploded in his arms as he stroked into her. He'd never seen anything as beautiful as that. His heart had broken to leave his new wife, that hadn't been a part of their plans, but now her memory worked to get him through the darkest, loneliest of days. He remembered her soft, pliant body in his arms, thought about how her hair felt on his face, and it pushed the darkness away. His life became his memories, and a fierce determination to make it home even before he was injured. Now his restless days in bed were spent recuperating and thinking of Mary. Home couldn't come fast enough. Chapter 3. Zebediah was in a head spin as he walked out of the barracks back in Norfolk, Virginia, and headed for the bus. He leaned heavily on a cane to compensate for his weak leg. He was still able to hoist and carry his hold all over his other shoulder, though. That had been his goal as he went through endless therapy to repair his damaged body. Going home was wonderful. Going home under his own steam meant everything. He climbed aboard the bus that would take him the first part of his journey to Charlotte, North Carolina. From there he would pick up another bus that would get him to Charles Station. He was initially alone on the bus until two teenage girls clambered aboard, chatting and giggling. They went quiet as they saw him sat halfway down the bus. Dressed in his best uniform, now carrying his sergeant chevrons and metal ribbons. They looked at him and then at each other, and started giggling again as they made their way past him to the back seat. They were these new hippie types, Zebediah guessed. Both were wearing thin tie-dye t-shirts and incredibly short denim shorts, frayed at the edges and leaving little to the imagination. Zebediah was at first shocked, but then smiled. Mary didn't need to dress like that to impress him. These girls were beautiful, but Mary was amazing. He sank comfortably back into his seat as the engine started and the bus pulled away. The bus climbed onto the freeway, and on it he sped through the day, pulling over just as the sun was setting outside a small diner. "Gonna take a break here, folks, if that's okay. Even drivers need a bathroom break. Get yourselves something to eat. They do a fine burger, and the apple pie is a real treat. All homemade, none of that modern junk. We'll set off again at 7. The bus driver called down the bus as he opened the doors. The two girls, still giggling and chatting, were off the bus almost as quickly as the driver and rushed over to the diner. Zebediah checked his pockets for his cigarettes and took his time working his way down the bus. He stepped down from the doors, and the driver was standing blowing smoke from his newly lit cigarette. "You take your time getting what you want, son. We won't be leaving one of our heroes behind. No worries on that score. The bus driver said. Tell Annie in there I recommended her apple pie. She'll take good care of you. Zebediah made his way into the cozy little diner. A young couple were sitting in one of the booths, too engrossed in each other to notice the hobbling soldier make his way slowly inside. He settled himself into a booth just as the two girls emerged from the bathrooms and noisily made their way into a booth next to him. Annie, the owner, came over quickly to Zebediah, flourishing a notepad and a smile. What can I get you, Sergeant? Coffee? She asked brightly. The driver recommended your apple pie, ma'am. I think a piece of apple pie with coffee would be just fine, thank you. Zebediah replied. Ah, old George loves my apple pie. He'll be getting himself some once he gets in. You won't be disappointed, Sergeant. Make it myself, I do. Annie said, as she moved quickly to the counter and the coffee pot to get Zebediah his coffee. She bypassed the two girls in the next booth as they tried to flag her attention. Be with you as soon as I've seen to the sergeant, honey. Don't worry, the bus won't be going without you. Zebediah sat back in the comfort of the simple but charming booth. There was nothing like this in Charles Station. Ma Quigley at the grocery store would sell coffee and malts, and had even set up a little table in one corner of her small shop, but nothing as welcoming as this. In fact, on a busy Saturday afternoon with the locals grabbing groceries, it was the last place someone would sit for a relaxing coffee. He was a good few hours from Charles Station yet. Simple as the town was, Zebediah missed it. He was looking forward to living the simple life again. For now, he would enjoy the journey. Annie, the owner, had arrived with his apple pie as he was finishing his first coffee. She'd brought the coffee pot with her and refilled the mug in his hand. You enjoy that pie, Sergeant? I have a feeling a strong man like you will be ready for a second piece, so I kept you one by just in case. She winked at him. Zebediah smiled awkwardly and thanked her. Apart from Mary, he had no real experience with women, and he could feel his face reddening at the attention. In the booth next door he could hear the girls giggling, and this just added to his discomfort. Looking over at the counter with its line of bar stools, he saw the driver sitting and enjoying himself a piece of apple pie and a coffee. He turned to nod at Zebediah, and then went back to his own food and chatting to Annie. They were all back on the bus before 7, and Annie had packed Zebediah a slice of pie to take with him. He accepted gratefully, but was somewhat bemused at her refusing his money for the coffee and pie he had eaten. My boy went over there 2 months ago. 19 he is. Annie said to him, as she pushed the money back into his hand. I'm just hoping he'll have a sergeant like you looking out for him over there is all. I'm glad you're home, son. Your son will be in good hands, ma'am, I promise. He'll be home before you know it, and ready for some of that fine apple pie. Zebediah had replied, trying to smile. All the time he was thinking of Jethro as he was blown across the jungle, separated from his legs. Some of those guys wouldn't be going home in anything but a wooden box. Jethro was no greenhorn either. Death was in the air for anyone over there, and the inexperienced were at greatest risk. Hopefully her son would gain that experience before meeting a messy end. Back on the bus, he had slid the apple pie into his holdall. Yes, it was good, and yes, he would enjoy this piece later. Hopefully, so would her son at some time. The bus pulled into Charlotte. The terminus was well lit and, even so late in the evening, still buzzing with people. All needing to be somewhere. Zebediah just needed home. The last bus that passed Charles Station was about to leave, and Zebediah climbed hurriedly aboard. He settled himself in an empty seat after loading his hold-all in the overhead rack. The bus was half full, he noted. It would wind through a dozen cities and small one-horse towns before reaching Charles Station. Zebediah decided his best bet was sleep. As much as he could get, and when he did wake, he would have himself a slice of pie. He was almost home. All was well. As the sun was rising, Zebediah noted they were perhaps an hour from Charles Station. He reached in his pocket for the pain pills the nurse had given him, before he left the camp and his last medical. You make sure you take these, Sergeant Resnake. You'll need plenty of rest first, then gentle exercise. These pills will just get you through the first few weeks. Then you'll need to see your doctor, and maybe get something a little lighter. Good luck to you, Sergeant, and welcome home, the nurse had said. Zebediah swallowed 2 of the pain pills, with a bottle of cola he'd picked up at one of the frequent stops they'd made. He eventually felt the pain in his leg begin to ease as the morphine worked its way into his bloodstream. He leaned back in the seat as the drug slowly relaxed him to an almost sleeping stupor. As he watched familiar landmarks flashing past the dirty window of the bus, he dragged himself back to reality. He stood himself up carefully and pulled his hold all down from the overhead rack. He slowly made his way to the front of the bus, stopping at each seat to grab a hold and recover his balance. The pain was disappearing into the background, but he was feeling groggy and heavy-headed as he got to the front. You can drop me anywhere around here, boss, Zebediah said to the driver. No problem, son, I know where you're headed. Best I can do is get you to the end of your road. That's a long walk you got ahead of you, son. Sorry about that, but I got to get this bus home and the rest of these passengers to their families too, the driver replied kindly. Zebediah looked down the bus at the handful of passengers all looking at him. Some looked at each other and shook their heads sadly. Zebediah became acutely aware of the cane in his hand and thought it must be obvious to everyone he was drugged up. He felt anger welling up as he looked down the bus at them, but the driver was slowing and pulling over to the road that led up to his homestead. The door swung open to allow Zebediah to exit. He climbed slowly down and gave a brief wave of thanks to the driver. Really sorry for your loss, son. We hope it all goes well from now on. We all go to Jesus one way or another, right? The driver said, preparing to close the door and pull away. Zebediah stared at him. Surely word of Jethro hadn't got here already. They never even knew Jethro. Maybe his arrival had been on the local news, and the story of how he got to come home, he pondered. He'd heard a lot of people now were protesting the war, targeting returning soldiers for abuse, and demanding they all come home. Not in these little places, though. Here they appreciated a man that had served in uniform. They would have all been trying to find out how he had been getting on. That was all. Just nosy country folk finding out about their own was all. Right, yeah. Thanks. I'm sure we all do, of course. Thanks again, Zebediah replied, feeling strange at the driver's comment. He turned and made his way up the road. He was home. It was a 3-mile walk he was looking forward to. Even in his broken condition, he felt like running all the way. Reality kicked in, and even the drugs weren't going to get him there any faster than one would expect of a broken man on a cane and carrying a hold-all. He recognized each tree he passed. The small stream that cut through the track caused him to pause. He would have normally just took a jumping step over it, but now he had to focus. He threw his bag across first, then the cane. He leaped and reached for the other side with his good leg. The weight of the rest of him and the drug-induced wobble saw him collapse on the other side. He rolled on his back and giggled. At least he'd made it across, and nobody was shooting at him, he thought as he slowly got to his feet and dusted himself off. Picking up the cane, he shouldered his bag and continued up the track. That should be the only obstacle to contend with, he thought. He might have to stop again on the way, but right now he just wanted to be home and in the arms of Mary. As he walked, he remembered he had the 2 letters. He could remember almost every word of the letter Mary had written him. He hoped all that stood true now he was broken and battered, but with her help, he knew he'd be back to the old Zebediah she'd married. He tried to recall the other letter. From his mother, he knew. He just couldn't remember what was in it. Each time he tried to think back, all he could do was remember the shots and explosion that led up to him ended up comatose and shattered. He couldn't remember at all. He reached into his jacket to retrieve them, but the pocket was empty. A different jacket, of course. Maybe they were still laid somewhere in a Vietnamese jungle. or in the hands of Vietnamese troops. Laughing over them. He frowned as he carried on walking. It was important, and he needed to remember. He couldn't. Whatever it was could wait until he saw his mother face to face. The track was overgrown, he noticed. Certainly no traffic had been using the track in a long time. Zebediah thought it strange. Surely Mary would have gone into town now and then, for those things they couldn't grow at home and to sell their extras? Maybe it had rained heavy of late, and the weeds and grass had shot up. He'd seen it do that before now. Now he was beginning to realize just how isolated their little piece of paradise was. How on earth could Mary have coped all this time without him? Stuck up here so far from friends, family, or anyone else for that matter? Mary's parents had died when she was still a teenager. She had no brother or sister, and had lived with her aunt before meeting Zebediah. For her, their marriage also meant getting away from the aunt she hated, and having a real place of her own with her man. It was never going to be an easy life for them there, and then Zebediah joined the army. They would have had to feed themselves and barter any extras they might have for the finer things in life, like clothing and maybe one day a truck. But Zebediah's dad had taught him all he knew about making moonshine, and the right people to sell it to. They would have survived. But now with the pension he would receive, they would do just fine. That truck just got a little bit bigger, and a whole lot newer than what they had hoped for in the past. As Zebediah gave a small wince at his leg as he moved up the road, he smiled to himself. Sure, wince away. You're paying for a Chevy deer leg. He could now see the house through the trees, half a mile away. It looked different. Dark, almost foreboding. Something certainly didn't look right. He knew he would see the house as soon as he cleared this last rise, and was hoping the sight of it would bring him joy and spur him on that last part of the journey. It didn't. As he got closer, he started to smell that unmistakable smell of burned wood. Wood that had burned and been extinguished with water. Lots of water. He had known a lot of houses in these parts that had gone up in flames. Neighbors would rally round to try to save the house, but these places were a tinderbox. The help was just to show willing neighbors and to stop a fire spreading. The chance of saving one of these places was slim. Zebediah had seen a few, smelled a few, and now recognized the unmistakable smell of a burned-down house. He shivered and froze. They would have told him, of course. They wouldn't send him home to a house that had burned down. Someone would have known. The bus driver would have known. The passengers would have known. They all knew about Jethro, didn't they? How could they not know his house had burned down? The smell hung heavy in the air as he made his way along the track. His heart leapt as he saw Mary standing at the gate. The house behind her was perfect. More than perfect. Damn those stupid drugs messing with his mind. He rushed the last 100 yards to his home and his wife, waiting with outstretched arms. Chapter 4. Zebediah rushed to the gate, dropping his bag on the way and thrashing the ground with his cane to speed him forward. He was angry at himself for his injuries slowing him down, but elated as he fell into Mary's arms. You made it. You made it. I knew you would. Come inside, my darling, I've missed you so much. Mary cried as she pulled him into the house, fearful of letting him go. Zebediah followed her through the front door and into the kitchen, where he could smell the sweet aroma of fresh-baked cornbread and the warm scent of the pot of bubbling beans. His stomach did somersaults as the smells invaded his nose. He settled himself on one of the chairs at the kitchen table and dropped his cane to the floor. Taking her hands from his shoulders, Mary moved to the wood stove. She plated up a large portion of beans from the pot and set it down before him with 3 large biscuits. Before you dive into that, I have someone who has been very excited to meet you. I told him you would be here today, Mary said as she disappeared from the room. She returned in a few moments, cooing and hushing the baby in her arms. Joshua gurgled with glee as he looked up at his father for the first time. His eyes wide, he opened his mouth and said, "Mama." "No, that's not Mama. Say Papa." Mary giggled. Zebediah reached cautiously for his son and cradled him gently in his arms. "Joshua?" I have a son called Joshua? I don't believe it. He is wonderful, Mary. Yes, Joshua, you are absolutely wonderful, Zebediah said. And mother? Is she in the back room? Mary lowered herself into one of the chairs at the table. Mama Risnake isn't with us, Zeb. I'm afraid she passed away while you were in the hospital. I think the shock of hearing about your condition caused her a heart attack. I'm so sorry, my love. I thought someone would have told you. I'm sorry I had to break it to you, Mary said. Zebediah passed Joshua back to Mary. Dead? My mother has died? Nobody told me anything, honey. He lowered his head into his hands and quietly began to sob. Mary came around behind him and laid a hand on his shoulder. Be strong now, Zebediah. You will need to be strong for me and Joshua here. That's what your mother would expect, Mary said. Yes. Yes, of course. Where is she buried, Mary? Zebediah asked. They took her off to the hospital at first, then buried her at the town cemetery. I was in the hospital too, then having Joshua, so we were kept pretty much out of things. I'm so sorry, my love. Eat, Zebediah. Then I will help you upstairs where you can rest. I know you will be needing a lot of rest now to get you healthy again. Please eat something, darling. Everything is going to be all right. We three are together at last. Forever, Mary replied. Zebediah spooned the warm beans into his mouth as he took it all in. He had looked forward to some real home cooking for longer than he could remember, yet though he was savoring every mouthful, the shock of his mother's death was biting deep, and he could feel his body starting to.
Censored.
He lowered the spoon and slowly stood up. Yes, Mary, perhaps I'd better lie down for a while. I don't feel too good. It has been a long trip, Zebediah said. Zebediah made his way to the stairs, with Mary right behind him. A nervous look on her face as she helped him climb the stairs, as if she thought he might flee at any minute. Zebediah didn't flee. Fleeing was the last thing on his mind. As he ascended the stairs to the bedroom, he could feel his body slowly collapsing from the exhaustion of all that had happened and the news he had just heard. A new son, all happy and gurgling, and a dead mother, buried somewhere he knew not. His head was spinning from it all as he reached the bed and lay down. He closed his eyes and instantly fell into a deep sleep. The smell and sound of sizzling bacon awoke Zebediah early the next morning. Downstairs, he could hear Mary talking to baby Joshua as she busied around the kitchen. The gentle aroma of freshly brewing coffee finished the job of bringing Zebediah to his senses. He immediately reached in his jacket pocket, that was hanging neatly on a chair by the bed, to retrieve his pain pills. As he reached over, he noticed he barely winced. Perhaps he would leave the pills until after breakfast, he pondered. Just use them when the pain really kicked in. He swung his legs out of the bed and slowly eased himself into a standing position. His leg, too, was keeping its pain hidden at a low ebb this morning, he noted. Perhaps the sleep and the home-cooked food the evening before was what he really needed after all, rather than pills and doctors. The smile that was forming on his face dropped as he recalled the news of his mother's death. That was something that neither home-cooked food nor pills was going to repair, he thought to himself. That was a pain he would have to bear himself for the rest of his life. He knew the grief would ease slowly as it had done with his father, but for now it was raw and it bit deep in his.
Censored.
He made his way down the stairs to the kitchen, where Mary was already filling a plate with bacon and eggs. He sat down smiling and happy at how Mary had taken to the house, and how confident she was in the kitchen. He's been expecting his mother's cooking. He knew his mother was a wonderful cook, and had been looking forward to it. To see Mary equal to the task made him smile. Did you sleep well, my love? Mary asked as she poured him a mug of hot, steaming coffee. I can't remember the last time I slept so well, Mary. I guess I needed it, right? Zebediah replied. He reached over to Joshua, sat in a high chair, and stroked his cheek. I'm so damn proud of you, little fella. You want some of Daddy's toast? He chuckled. He's a long way from chomping on a slice of toast, just yet, Zebediah Resnake. Let me worry about feeding young Joshua, and you tuck into those eggs and bacon. I've been waiting to have my man back in my arms. Now eat up and let's get your strength built up, fella. Mary chortled. Mary sat down opposite Zebediah at the kitchen table and nibbled on a slice of toast. Is that all you're having, Mary? You can't do a full day looking after me and the baby on just a slice of toast, honey. Zebediah said. I ate earlier, dear, when I was dressing Joshua this morning. Eat and enjoy. Then I'm going to give you a bath, just as soon as Joshua takes his nap. Mary replied. A bath, Think I need one, do you? Zebediah smirked. I want to examine that beautiful body of yours, darling. I've missed it for so long. Mary replied, smiling sweetly. As Zebediah settled at the kitchen table and enjoyed a cigarette with his fresh mug of coffee, Mary cleaned up the dishes and took Joshua out to his own room. As they were gone, Zebediah gazed around the old kitchen. Everything was as it was, and Mary hadn't changed how his mother used to have it. No need to really, Zebediah thought. Mother had this kitchen down to a fine art. Knew where everything was, and had all she needed to hand. He gazed out of the window and looked out to the creek below. It wasn't far from the house at all, and a large pool had formed that they had all used for swimming and fishing. Even in summer, the water would be ice cold and fresh. He smiled as he thought back over the years, to all the times of swimming in that cold water. He shivered and laughed to himself just as he felt a hand caressing his shoulder. He turned to find Mary standing behind him. She was
censored.
She placed a finger to his lips and, taking his hand, led him into the back room where the large bathtub was filled with hot, soapy water. Zebediah undressed, pausing to look back at Mary with the removal of each article he wore. He knew his body was scarred, and he didn't want to disgust her. He'd looked back to see the clear look of love and adoration in her eyes, never shifting to disgust, and before long he stood
censored
before her. She smiled and took him into her arms, pulling him close. I love you, Zebediah Resnake, all of you, scarred, torn, shot, or broken. You're mine, and I love you however you are, my darling. She pulled away after
censored
him once more and gestured to the bathtub. Let me wash away all of those bad memories. He let her help him into the tub, and he sank down in the water gratefully with a deep sigh. The heat of the water she spent so long preparing bucket by bucket soaked in through his skin, down into his bones, and did more to ease his
censored
than anything else had. There was something comforting about being surrounded with hot water. Zebediah relaxed and sank back as Mary began scrubbing up his hair, gently rubbing over the scarred area she found. He heard her gasp and tut as she felt the scar. But her touch was awakening memories and his body. She was gentle as she rinsed his hair, but as her fingers moved lower down his neck and to his
censored,
Zebediah felt a new need, a need to make love to his beautiful wife.
This scene has been censored to provide a safe and enjoyable reading experience for everyone.
Chapter 5. Cherokee Joe sat on the edge of his bunk, gazing down at the letters in his hand. They were the letters that had dropped from Zebediah's pocket as they had carried him from the jungle. Lieutenant Simpson had insisted on returning there with a tank unit the following day, and of course, Cherokee Joe had been expected to attend. They'd cleared out the area thoroughly of anything they may have dropped during the firefight. The tanks then stood back as an artillery barrage blasted away at the old fort and surrounding jungle. The tanks rolled in with a platoon of infantry and Lieutenant Simpson and Cherokee Joe to mop up and look for any useful intelligence. Joe had found the letters down in one of the Vietnamese tunnels. They were sat on a table with a Zippo lighter perched on top. Cherokee Joe had recognized it immediately. It had a U.S. Marine crest on it and a large dent in the side where it had saved the owner from a bullet. Unfortunately for the owner, it wasn't saved from Zebediah's arm wrestling skills. He had beaten the Marine 3 times in a row to take the lighter and $20. The money wouldn't be much use for a while out in the steaming jungle, but the Zippo was a great win. Zebediah treasured it, and always had it with him. There was little else of interest down in the tunnel, and Cherokee Joe had left and tossed in a grenade to leave the tunnel useless. Now he sat on the bunk and read the letters, feeling a moment of shame to be reading the private thoughts of another man's woman. He would return them, of course. He could drop them in the mail and hope they would eventually find Zebediah, or he could of course take them himself. He had 2 more months left in this stinking hellhole before he shipped home. He would be headed for his home in North Carolina. He had lived within the Qualla all his life. There he had roamed the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Old Smokies, just like his ancestors before him. Although the land his people now had was far less than his ancestors, at least they could sleep without the worry of a white raiding party, rounding them up, butchering them and herding what was left of them into some disease-ridden camp. Yes, he decided. In 2 months, he would head home and then seek out Zebediah to return his letters and his lighter. He folded them carefully into his pocket, stood up from the bed, and strolled out to visit the new faces that had joined the unit that morning. He looked them over sadly, wondering how many of them would make it through these first few weeks in the cauldron. Those that learned the jungle quickly, and learned to listen to Cherokee Joe and Lieutenant Simpson, would hopefully make it home in one piece. The others? Maybe not. He was determined this time, he would not be getting attached emotionally to anyone. He had one goal now. Survive the next 2 months and get the hell out of this madness. Chapter 6. Zebediah had woken early. The day of lovemaking had turned into a longer evening of unbridled passion. Mary was insatiable, and Zebediah was shocked at the ferocity of her lovemaking. Shocked, too, at his ability to keep up. His shoulder, his leg, and of course his head were all feeling much better. He hadn't taken his painkillers yesterday, and he wasn't feeling he should take anything today. He felt good. Incredibly good. The pills made him groggy. They clouded his mind and confused his memories. Strangely, now as his mind was clearing, all he could seem to remember was here. The house. Mary and Joshua. He seemed to have lost all recollection of the past. The events in Vietnam. The death of his mother. That all seemed like it had almost happened to someone else. Someone he may have read about in the paper, or heard about on the radio, but not him. It just didn't seem to relate to his life at all. Awake now and pondering this strange mind change, Zebediah dressed and made his way downstairs. Mary was busy in the kitchen, working on breakfast. She smiled as he sat down and passed him a mug of coffee. "Do you think you can handle a steak for breakfast, darling? Steak and eggs? I think we need to get your strength built up if you want more of yesterday, and look after the animals and the garden too," Mary said before smiling. Zebediah felt his face flushing as Joshua looked at him gurgling and smiling too. Yes, of course. A steak would be wonderful. But where did you find the money to get steak? More's the point, how did you get it? You never left the house, Zebediah said. Oh, it was in the cold room, darling. I picked it up the day before you got home. It needs eating, so let's not let it go to waste, okay? Mary replied as she slid the hot sizzling steak onto a plate, and then slid 2 perfectly fried eggs on the top of it. Eat up, husband. It's good to have my man back at last. You are a hero, Zebediah, and I intend to look after your every needs, Mary said. I was thinking of taking a walk into town today, Zebediah said. Mary turned quickly from the stove and glared at him. Whatever for Zeb, darling? There was never anything down in the town before you left. There's even less there now. No. You're not strong enough yet, my love. You must rest. Perhaps you can play with Joshua today, and have a short walk in the garden. You'll be fit enough for the long trip to town soon enough. Well, okay. Zebediah responded, shocked at how Mary had reacted. He reached for his coffee and stared down at the cup, bemused and a little confused. He finished the steak breakfast in silence, and eventually made his way outside into the yard with Joshua in his pram. It was good to feel the sun on his face again in his own home. The garden looked wonderful. Mary must be an incredible gardener too to have managed to raise so many and such varied crops all on her own. The house too. Zebediah's father had spent longer and longer on his moonshine than working on the house, and it had suffered. The roof sagged, and in a heavy downpour would leak into the kitchen. The whole house looked as good as new now. Soon Zebediah found himself on the track leading to town, and he began to gently stroll down it. As he did, he began to smell the faintest hint of wood smoke. He carried on, and the pain in his head, his arm and his leg started making their presence known. No, he certainly wouldn't get far without his cane, he thought, and maybe a couple of painkillers at least to get him to town. Mary was right. Too soon was too soon. He would try again another day, and make sure he was prepared with his pills and his cane. For now he turned back, and made his way into the house where Mary was waiting for him with a smile. "You okay, baby?" she asked. "Sure. I just had a slow walk down the track, but you're right. I'm not ready for it just yet. I'll try another day, I reckon. How about some more of that coffee of yours?" he replied. Mary poured him a mug of coffee, and settled herself in the chair opposite as she cuddled Joshua to her. "I can't remember this old place ever looking so good, Mary. I was almost embarrassed to bring you here when we married, but you've sure done the place well." "Who helped you?" Zebediah asked. "Oh, the people from town rallied round when you left. They all wanted to do their bit to make sure I was taken care of while you were away." Mary replied. "That's great of them, but I'll be taking care of you from now on." Zebediah gave his wife a dirty grin, and she giggled. Zebediah held his arms out to his wife, and she joined him in the handmade chair, straddling his waist as she sat down on him. "Think the chair is up for it?" Zebediah inquired, not really caring. "Oh, I think it'll manage. Will you?" as the question of the hour, she said as she unbuttoned the top of her simple cotton dress. Navy blue with pink flowers. Zebediah wished he could buy her silks and furs, but loved the way the dress came open.
This scene has been censored to provide a safe and enjoyable reading experience for everyone.
It was some days later, before Zebediah convinced himself he could make the walk into town, and he was not having any argument from Mary. "It's too far, Zeb. You'll get stuck down there and not be able to get back. I won't be able to come and get you, because I'll be stuck here with Joshua. Please don't go, Zeb, I beg you." Mary had pleaded. "No, Mary. I need to do this. We can't live like hermits up here forever. I have a bit of money now from my pension, and there are things we need. I shall take my time, but I will get there, and I will get back. Now you make sure there's a supper ready for me, okay? I'll be careful. Trust me, I've been on much nastier trails than this." Zebediah replied. He pocketed his pills and gathered up his cane and a knapsack. He headed out of the door without looking back. He could hear Mary sobbing behind him, but kept his head focused on the route ahead. Today he was going to town. He was a half-mile down the track before he started feeling the groaning
Censored
in his shredded leg. When Mary had bathed him, she'd taken her time to go gently over the torn muscles in his leg and his arm. He thought the injuries would have repulsed her, but she cooed and soothed as she gently soaped the wounds. His head too now carried a huge scar barely covered by his newly grown hair. He had felt he looked like a lead in a freak show, but Mary continued to tell him how handsome and manly he looked. As his legs started to throb, he began to feel less than manly, and lowered himself to the ground for a rest. He reached into a pocket and took 2 of the pain pills from the bottle. Opening the knapsack, he pulled out a mason jar of moonshine. This was good stuff he'd had stored since before he left. Maybe not the best thing to wash down painkillers with, but at the moment it was a gift from heaven. He swallowed the pills and smiled at the warm burning as the alcohol trickled down his throat. It was a slower trip than he had planned, but eventually he arrived in Charles Station. As he was walking past the tiny church, he almost stumbled headlong into Reverend Andrew Halcombe. He had been the town reverend since before Zebediah was born. The Resnakes had not gone to his church as often as perhaps good God-fearing folk should, but the Reverend understood they lived far out in the holler and on occasion had driven out to visit them. "Are you well, Zebediah? We are all so pleased you came back from that evil place alive. I'm so sorry about your bereavement. We all go to a better place, of course, but your mother was a wonderful woman. So tragic," Reverend Halcombe said. "Thank you, sir," Zebediah replied. "It's good to be home for sure. I've been meaning to take a drive up to see you, Zebediah, if that's okay. I have to dash now. I'm late for an appointment with Martha Morgan, on the other side of town. I shall get up there as soon as I can, my friend. Take care now and good to have you home," Reverend Halcombe said, as he patted Zebediah on the shoulder and jumped into his station wagon and roared off down the street. Zebediah stood watching the car speed away, in a cloud of dust. He had a lot he wanted to ask the Reverend. It would wait until he visited, he guessed, and he continued towards the grocery store. He was limping badly now and leaning heavily on his cane. His head and his arm were throbbing and he reached for his pills. Too soon for more, he thought. Maybe with a coffee at the grocery store. As he got closer to the store, he noticed people giving him stares. Many were lowering their heads and shaking them. Zebediah assumed that they were sad for him losing his mother, or perhaps they were sympathetic to his injuries. His injuries wouldn't improve by standing in the street worrying over it, he thought, as he straightened himself up and entered the grocery store. "Oh, Zebediah Resnake. Good to have you home, son. What can I get you?" the woman behind the counter said. "A coffee, please, for now. I'll pick up a few things to take back in a while, if that's okay," Zebediah replied. "You take all the time you like, dear, I'll get your coffee," came the reply. The coffee was good, and Zebediah took the chance to swallow down another of his pain pills as he savored the hot liquid. The drugs were good, but they did make him groggy. Hopefully the coffee would give him enough of a kick to allow him to buy a few supplies. He looked around the shelves from his little corner of the shop. Sat at a small table with 2 seats, the shop was never intended to be a diner. He decided on some peanut butter, chocolate bars, and a few other things he thought might liven up their diet at the house. He selected his shopping and placed it on the counter with his money. The woman took the money, and he loaded the groceries into his rucksack. "How you coping up there, young Zebediah, in your condition? You need to move down into town and get some lady to look after you after all you've been through. What on earth makes you stay up in those hills?" Zebediah couldn't decide if the grogginess from the pills were slowing his thoughts, or if the woman was actually talking nonsense. "We're managing just fine, thanks, and Mary takes real good care of me. She's the only woman I'll ever need," Zebediah replied, making his way out of the store as quickly as his crippled leg would allow him. He took a glance back at the woman as he left. She looked white as a sheet, and was trying to mouth some sort of a reply. She held her hand up to her mouth as she muttered, "Of course, Zebediah, you poor man. Of course she does." He staggered out of the store into the street. The pain was taking its toll, and he needed to make his way home. The way he was feeling, that might take him a lot longer than he had planned. Making his way out of town and back up the track to home was a struggle. Every step cut deep. The sun was high in the sky, and he could feel the sweat forming on his body. He could feel the salt burning into his scars and winced. He lowered himself to the ground to rest. He lay back on the edge of the track using the rucksack as a pillow and pulled out the moonshine. As the smooth liquid eased into his system, he felt a calm overcome him, and he lay back, allowing his eyelids to close against the sun's rays. He snapped them open as he heard a helicopter crossing the sky above him. He looked and could pick out clearly the gunner hanging by the door. Then another chopper, and another. They flew low, and he could see they were grouping over a patch of jungle. All 3 began to open fire into the trees. The jungle exploded in front of him, as he watched in horror as 2 planes flew ahead and sprayed napalm over the already burning trees. He screamed. The scream woke him from his nightmare, and he lay shaking and trembling. He only had a mile to go, he thought. He should pull it together now. get himself up the hill to Mary and Joshua and home. This wasn't Vietnam. This was West Virginia. He was safe. As he stood, he noticed a large copperhead snake staring at him. It sat some 3 feet away from him, as he had his nightmare flashback. Now it was curled in a tight ball, gazing blankly at him. Zebediah smiled and shrugged. You scare me less than Charlie ever did, fella. He'd turn you into a belt and eat you. Get gone before I do the same. Zebediah stepped up the track away from the snake, who, looking totally bemused at the whole affair, slithered into the undergrowth by the track. As he made his way to the gate, Zebediah felt his pains easing and his head clearing. The moonshine had eventually started working on the pills, he thought, smiling to himself. He smiled broader still when he saw Mary at the door with Joshua, waiting for him. He staggered into the house and sat himself down at the kitchen table. Well, that was a strange day, he said. People seem to have gone a little bit crazy down there, or were they always like that? The only people that would choose to stay in Charles Station have to be crazy, Zebediah. We always knew that. Mary laughed. Chapter 7. As the days passed, Zebediah could feel his wounds recovering from the trip to town. Mary insisted on waiting on him hand and foot, cooking up superb dinners and doting on him at every opportunity. She begged him not to go back to town and risk his health again. It had been almost a week since Zebediah had gone into town, and it came as a shock to hear a car making its way up the overgrown track. Zebediah made his way to the front door from the kitchen to investigate the mystery visitor. He soon recognized the old Dodge of Reverend Halcombe, shuddering its way to the house on the ruts and potholes. The Reverend pulled up outside, and Zebediah began to make his way from the front door to the car as the Reverend began to open the door and step out. The Reverend stood, wiping his brow, as he looked towards the approaching Zebediah. He was smiling as Zebediah approached, and in an instant Zebediah watched as the Reverend's face turned white as a sheet, and his eyes bulged in terror. Zebediah turned to see what could have caused such a fright, only to see Mary emerging from the house with baby Joshua in her arms. Without a word, the Reverend leaped back into the driver's seat and started the engine as he continued to stare in horror at Mary. Without thinking to close the driver's door, he heaved the car around in a dust-spewing circle before racing off down the hill from the house. Zebediah stood gazing blankly at the disappearing car, before turning back to Mary. What in hell's name was that all about? He looked like he'd just seen a ghost or something worse. Crazy guy, Zebediah muttered. Perhaps we need to talk? Mary replied. About? Do you have any clue what spooked him like that? Zebediah asked. We'll chat later. No, I don't know why he had to leave so suddenly, Zebediah. Maybe he forgot he had to be somewhere else. Mary replied. Wherever it was, it sure wasn't here. Zebediah added, as he returned to the front door and followed Mary back into the house. That afternoon, Zebediah shouted out to Mary. I think it's hot enough for a dip in the creek, baby. We've not been for a swim since I got home. Get your stuff and we'll go have a splash around for a while. No, I don't think so, Zeb, came the reply from upstairs. It's still too cold, and it won't do your wounds any favors, honey. Come up here a while and we can cuddle on the bed. Zebediah had expected a negative, and had already decided he was going anyway. With or without Mary. He almost vaulted over the garden gate, as he made a limping run of glee down to the creek. 100 feet from the creek, he was already stripping, and was down to his boxer shorts as he plunged into the icy cold pool. His heart almost stopped when the freezing water engulfed his body. He exploded to the surface, gasping for air with a huge scream of jubilation. He felt good. Not looking back, he dived again. The bottom of the creek at the middle was about 10 feet, and he could feel his lungs stretching to the limit as he clung to the weeds at the bottom to hold himself down. He was ecstatic at the challenge and the cold on his body. His scars were feeling the burning cold too, though, and much as he wanted to fight back, they forced him to let go and drift to the surface. His head broke the water, and he turned to the house to wave at Mary wherever she might be. The house had gone. All he could see was a smoldering ruin of where the house had once been. The beautiful garden that surrounded it was now torn up mud and weeds among the wrecked and burned timbers. In the air he could smell the old scent of a burned-down house that might have been. He almost gagged as he tried to clear his eyes and shook his head. This was madness. His madness, he felt as he slapped the side of his head hard. He could feel his whole body starting to fade into shock and despair as he gazed upon the ruin. He couldn't have done this, could he? He didn't leave something near the stove? A cigarette fallen out of an ashtray? Maybe Mary had had an accident and had been screaming for him, and he never heard down at the bottom of the pool. He swam around to a large tree, a few hundred yards up the creek. There he saw two graves. Not new, and partly covered in the fallen leaves from the tree. Not new but not old either. Certainly not graves that Zebediah ever remembered being there under that tree, and he knew this mountain like the back of his hand. His confusion and the shock had hit him deep. He realized he was now floundering in water out of his depth. He needed to get back to the shore. He needed to get dressed. He needed to find Mary and Joshua. He needed to know what the hell was going on. He felt the wound in his arm chewing at him and unbalancing him. His leg too began to tear itself at the large gash that had been opened in the explosion. The pain was making him struggle hard. Fighting with his one good arm and one good leg to keep himself afloat, he began to go round in a circle as he tried to get control and stop himself sinking into the pool. With the house behind him now, he could feel tears welling up as he realized he was drowning. They were tears of sadness, though not fear or panic. No home and no Mary meant there was no reason for him not to drown anyway. This might be the blessing he needed. His body slowly turned back towards the house. It now stood there in all its glory. The garden looking colorful and food-laden. The shingles on the roof glistened back at him in the warm afternoon sun. He crashed his way through the water back to the shore. Reaching the safety of the shore, he hobbled to gather his clothes. He looked over to where the tree was. No graves were there now. Just a rambling and twisted rose bush that had taken the opportunity of the fine weather to flourish for the year. Zebediah shook his head and tapped his ears to release the water in them. It had to be insanity. The pain. The pills. The war. All more than his head could handle surely. The house was there, and he knew Mary and Joshua were safe inside it. Slowly he made his way to the gate and the front door. As he reached to open it, Mary was at the other side waiting for him. She scowled sternly. "You mustn't ever do that again, Zebediah Resnake. You are an injured man. You could have drowned. Come into the kitchen, and I shall make you a hot cocoa." Zebediah lowered his head as he made his way to a seat at the kitchen table. He looked around, confused and dazed. Yes, the house was here, and the house was as beautiful as Mary had made it. He, on the other hand, was obviously insane. "We need to talk, Mary. We need to talk real bad," Zebediah said. "Of course we do, honey. You really need to stop pushing yourself. You're making yourself ill," Mary replied. "No. Sit down, please, and listen. I think I'm going crazy. I think that bullet to the head did more damage than folk realize. I was in the creek. I saw the house burn down. I saw graves under the sycamore tree. I'm seeing crazy stuff, girl. I'm going insane. The stuff I saw was as real as you sitting right there right now." Zebediah sighed and lowered his head into his hands. He could feel his body was shaking all over, and he could feel his wounds. They bit at him like a hungry dog gnawing on a bone. "You are trying too hard and expecting too much, Zeb. I will be with you forever. You have nothing to prove. I just want you to relax and enjoy what we have, baby. Now go upstairs and rest," Mary said. Zebediah eased himself from the chair and made his way up the stairs with Mary following close behind. He pulled off his clothes and lowered himself onto the bed. Within a few minutes, he was in a deep sleep. As he slept, he dreamed of the burned-out house, of Mary decomposing in front of him as he tried to hold her together. Joshua was slipping from her grasp as her hands dried up and turned to dust. Zebediah was reaching for both, and both were disappearing before his eyes. He screamed out and woke himself up. Mary was sat beside the bed, cooing and stroking his cheek. Joshua nestled in her arms. "Just a dream, sweetheart. Just a dream is all," Mary said. Zebediah fell back into a fitful sleep. He tossed and turned as he flashed back to the explosion in Vietnam and his vision of the burned-down house. It was dark when he next woke to find Mary lying beside him. Her arm rested gently across his.
Censored.
He gazed at her soft and delicate face lit only by the moonlight. He smiled as he stroked her cheek and saw a gentle smile on her face. Her face changed. It began to dry and crack. He looked on in anguish as her arm began to decompose across his.
Censored.
He could feel his heart begin to race and his breath quicken as he watched in horror as her skeleton was all that remained in the bed before disappearing completely. He turned sharply over and reached for his jacket on the chair by the bed. With shaking hands, he took out a couple of painkillers and swallowed them dry. Gagging, he reached under the bed for the jar of moonshine he had placed there. He took a deep draught and dropped back onto the bed, gasping. The bedroom door opened, and Mary stepped into the room. She looked at him with the moonshine jar in his hand and tutted. "I don't think that will be curing anything, Zebediah Resnake. Do you?" she said. "Sometimes a man needs a drink, Mary. It don't need any questioning, it just is," Zebediah replied, lowering the jar back under the bed. He woke the next morning to the warm scent of Mary cooking breakfast downstairs. His head was thumping, but as he felt around his body, he smiled. At least everything was still attached, and again, here in the house, he was feeling stronger and healthier. He got dressed and went downstairs to the kitchen. "Sorry about yesterday, baby. I guess I overdid it," Zebediah said. "Sit yourself down, honey. Bacon, eggs, and biscuits. That'll make anyone's nightmares leave, right?" Mary replied. "Yeah, just nightmares is all. I'm starving," Zebediah said, as he accepted the heavily laden plate of breakfast. It took Zebediah a couple of days before he would venture out of the house. When he did, he was fearful to look at it, scared to see what he'd seen from the creek. Looking over to the large sycamore tree, there was again no trace of the graves he'd seen. Slowly, he began to help around the garden, following Mary around like a child as he held the basket as she filled it with the vegetables from the garden. He was staggered at how much she had managed to grow. His mother had always been an expert gardener as far as he could remember, but Mary was growing foods his mother wouldn't even attempt. "This is good soil, Zebediah," he remembered his mother saying. "Best growing soil in the country. We is blessed. But some things just weren't meant to grow in these parts, so no sense in tryin'." Mary obviously hadn't had the same lecture. They would pick what they needed for the winter and spend a few weeks pickling and canning it all. The food they would store in the cellar would see them through the harshest of winters, and this part of West Virginia certainly knew about hard winters. As Zebediah gained his strength, he started splitting the wood they would need for winter too. A huge pile of section trees were all ready to be split down into bite-sized pieces for the stove in the kitchen and the huge roaring fire in the middle of the house. Cutting the wood and stacking it now in the summer would ensure it was good and dried through. "I'm thinking of going back to town tomorrow, Mary," Zebediah said over breakfast one morning. "What on earth for? You don't need that pain again. Wait until I can leave you with Joshua alone for a few hours, and I'll go for anything we might need. Not that I can think of anything we might need, mind. You don't need to be going back down there, darling." "That I do know," Mary replied. "I want to go and see the Reverend. That was all some strange stuff going on with that man. I need to talk to him is all. And I'll take my pills and cane. And I'll take my damn time too this time," Zebediah replied. "He's crazy as a box of frogs. Just like most of the folk in that town. No, you don't need to see him. If it's important, he'll come back, won't he? Yes, sure he will. If he needs Zebediah Snake, he knows where to find him. Fella got himself a fancy car. He doesn't need to hobble round the countryside on a walking cane like you do. Mary said angrily. Zebediah sighed. Maybe you're right. We'll see how it goes. I think perhaps we could use some old car like that for ourselves. I got enough money for something as long as it's got 4 wheels. Would make life a bit easier for us, right? Life is just perfect, darling. So you go and buy a truck to sit outside and rust? We don't have anywhere to be but here, and nobody we need to see but ourselves. If folk kept their business to themselves, this would be a much better place of a world, I think. Mary replied. Perhaps. But if I get one, it means going into town to find one. They don't hang around in trees waiting to drop on a buyer. And I can get the still working. Pa used to make a bit of money from the moonshine. Nothing fancy, just to the locals we know. Wouldn't be much, but it would help when Joshua grows and needs a new set of pants. We'll talk about it another time, baby. For now, Joshua has all he needs and we're doing just fine. Save it all for another time, please, darling. Mary replied. Zebediah sagged in his chair and grunted. He carried on eating breakfast in silence, feeling Mary's eyes on him. He knew there was little point in arguing. He also knew that the last trip to town was a lot more than he'd bargained for. But yes, he needed to understand why the Reverend sped off like he did. He at least needed to know that. He'd save it for another day. That day came soon enough. Mary had announced she would spend a day in the garden with Joshua. Zebediah had calmly picked up his rucksack and packed it with pills, water, and a jar of moonshine. He dug a baseball cap out of his holdall and gathered his walking cane under his arm. While you two are enjoying the garden, I'm going for a short stroll to the moonshine still, honey. He lied. Seriously? That's an awkward climb through that forest, baby. We haven't been there since you got home. The path will be overgrown, and I doubt there will be anything usable when you get there. Mary replied. No worries. I'll take my time and I just want to see the old places all. Might be some rocket fuel left up there I can bring down. Zebediah laughed. Well, you go slow. And come straight back if things start hurting. Whatever you find up there won't be worth the pain you'll be in, my love. Mary said as she eyed him suspiciously. You enjoy your day with Joshua, darling. I'll take my time and yes, I'll be careful. I'll be ready for dinner when I get back. Zebediah said as he departed through the front door and down to the gate. He would have to do something of a circuit if Mary was watching him. Follow the track in the opposite direction from town and then up into the woods. A narrow, overgrown path from there led up into the hill and onto the moonshine still his father had built and hidden so well. Zebediah wasn't planning on going that far. Once above the house, he would circle around and then drop back down onto the lane to town. It might add half an hour to his journey, but hopefully he might get some answers from the Reverend, and he might be driving home in a truck. Maybe Mary would be a little more enthused if he turned up in something they could take trips out in. He hit the lane after a hacking stomp through the thick overgrown woods and headed for Charles Station. Mary had been right. The track to the still was well overgrown now. Nobody had been there in a long, long time, Zebediah thought, and certainly no revenue men had been near the place. He could feel his
censored
growing as he got to the main street through the little town. He stopped and took a couple of pain pills from his bag. He swilled them down with a drink of water, fastened the pack and carried on towards town. He was pleased to see the door to the little chapel of Reverend Halcombe was open, and he ventured inside. It was tiny with seats for maybe 30 people to sit, and little room for any latecomers who might have to stand. Not that there were that many people in the town itself anyway. The folk up in the hills rarely came down this far, just for a church service. The only time Reverend Halcombe need worry about overcrowding was the usual births, deaths and marriages. Sunlight bounced through the high windows, and the one fancy-colored glass one exploded rainbows over the pulpit at the front, standing before a huge cross that had been carved from 2 local trees. It was intentionally rough-hewn and primitive. Reverend Halcombe had insisted on it. He wanted the people to know just what sort of painful and cruel torture device their savior had died on. The locals, of course, didn't quite see it that way, and thought the Reverend was going cheap to save collection money for his other pursuits outside the church. He didn't actually have any, except perhaps enjoying some of the finest moonshine in the area. Usually that came with a nod and a wink from the supplier, in the hope of a good word on Sunday. As Zebediah moved into the church, he could see the Reverend sitting in the front pew. He was reading a book of Psalms, and was looking intent and nervous. Zebediah was shocked to see he was actually trying to make sense of what was in the book, as he saw him flicking backward and forward through the chapters as if looking for an answer to something. "Reverend, could we have a word?" Zebediah said gently. The Reverend sat bolt upright and swiveled in the pew. Certainly. I'll be right with." The Reverend's voice trailed off as he turned to face Zebediah. "Ah, Zebediah. I have been thinking and praying for you, son," Reverend Halcombe said. "You have? Well, here I am. I was wanting to ask why you left in such a hurry the other day is all," Zebediah replied. "I'm sorry for that, son. A trick of the light is all. I thought I saw Mary coming out of the front of your house." "Mary indeed. How ridiculous does that sound?" Reverend Halcombe said. "I'm not sure I understand. Why shouldn't she? It's her home too," Zebediah said. The Reverend turned ashen, and he could feel himself gripping his book of Psalms as he tried to face Zebediah. Somewhere in this book was an answer, and he couldn't find it. Somewhere in this chapel should be some sort of explanation, but it was lost to him. Perhaps he wasn't what he thought he was. Perhaps he was in no position to give guidance to anyone. Perhaps he was as insane as the man standing in front of him. "Mary is dead, Zebediah. Mary has been dead a good long time, son. Your house is a burned-down ruin. You need help, my friend, serious help, but I just don't know how to help you. You see, I saw the house as good as new, and I saw Mary standing at the door, and that makes me crazy too, right? Crazy because I'm the one that helped bury her and your mother. Crazy because you live in the ruins of your house and know nothing about any of this." Tears began to flow down the Reverend's cheeks as he looked at Zebediah, and could see the anger welling up in the man's face. "Yes, you are insane, preacher. My wife is as alive as we are, and so is my son Joshua," Zebediah snapped. "The house is better than it ever was, and that's all thanks to Mary and the work she put into it." "What the hell are you talking about?" "I saw it, Zebediah. I saw your fancy house, and I saw your beautiful wife. I saw it too. That's why I had to run. I knew it was impossible. I knew it was either a trick of the light or the work of the devil. Whatever it was, I know what it wasn't. It wasn't your wife because I buried her, and it wasn't your house because that was the fire your wife and mother died in. You see? I'm as insane as you are." Zebediah dropped into a pew. The pain was coursing through his body from his arm, and his leg and his head throbbed and pulsed. But anger and frustration were filling him more than the pain ever could. He slowly rocked back and forth on the pew, banging his head on the backrest in front. Either to stop the pain or stop the nonsense words of the Reverend, he wasn't sure. "Stop that now, Zebediah. You are ill. We all been worrying over you up there on your own, but folk don't like to go sticking their nose into other folks' business, right? But you are ill, son. You need help. Let me go get Dr. Morgan to come take a look at you. You can stay here tonight. You don't need to be sleeping up in those woods no more. Move on down here into town where you can be cared for. I have a room here in the chapel at the back you can use, Zebediah, until you find a proper place." The Reverend said. "No, I need to get home," Zebediah replied. "I don't know what you tell the folk that come to your church, but I think you are a crazy old man. You need to be kept away from selling your madness to the folk round here. Zebediah tapped the side of his head and turned to leave. Zebediah, I've known you since you were a boy, son. Please let me help you. Your mother, God rest her soul, would want me to do all I could to help you. Reverend Halcombe said. Zebediah spun on his heel and faced the Reverend. Do not ever mention my mother. She would never let your mad ramblings in our house. I know it. Zebediah limped out of the chapel, grimacing with every step. He could feel the blood pulsing through his temples as he stood outside the door looking left and right. Should he go and find Frank Williams and sort himself a truck, or should he just get himself home and be done with this crazy place? His head swiveled back and forth as he weighed up the matter. A truck would be a much easier trip home, and he was feeling every step again. But every moment he spent in this town was driving him crazier and crazier. He set off for home, and could feel the blood easing around his forehead. The pain in his wounds still burned and groaned at him, but he could feel that cold, dark pain of his anger slowly leaving his head. Home it was going to be. He reached the turn for the lane that led home, and after a half-mile he stopped and lowered himself down again. He began to laugh. He laughed until he roared and shook his head, as tears streamed down his face. What on earth would possess a God-fearing man like Reverend Halcombe to spout that madness? He reached in his pack and pulled out the jar of moonshine. He took a long swallow of the smooth liquid and gasped as it hit his throat. Then another before replacing the lid and dropping it back into his pack. The copperhead he'd seen the last time was sat opposite him, curled snugly on the other side of the path, staring blankly at him. I'm living with a dead woman and a non-existent child, Mr. Copperhead. So yes, I deserve a drink, don't you think? Zebediah said, looking back at the snake. It never moved its gaze, but stared as if encouraging him to continue his rant. My house, of course, doesn't exist either. It's a burned-out ruin I'm living in. No bedroom to sleep in. No kitchen to drink my coffee in, just a burned-out ruin. Now how do you think I wouldn't have noticed that, Mr. Snake? How'd I get through the day without thinking, hey, this is fine coffee but it tastes like old embers? Or is that just the chair I'm sitting on? That's why my ass is so hot, right? Zebediah burst out laughing again, and the snake backed its head away into its coils somewhat, still staring intently at Zebediah. Sorry, Mr. Copperhead. Didn't mean to startle you. Just one of those crazy days in town, see? Like you, I prefer to be up here in the sunshine and the trees. Don't think I'll be needing to see those folk down there no more. Zebediah finished and stood up carefully, taking the weight onto his cane. He saluted the copperhead and made his way slowly up the lane. He knew he would have to go back through the woods above the house, to look as if he had dropped down from the moonshine still, and it was a struggle. His head was spinning with the crazy ramblings of the Reverend, and the desperation of getting back to the safety of Mary and her loving arms. He sweat and groaned as the tree limbs sprang back at him, slowing his climb. Eventually, he was above the house. He looked down and could see nothing. He panicked. He knew this hill. He had made more trips up here to the still in the evening and darkness than he ever had in the daytime. He knew exactly where the house should be. Exactly. But it wasn't there. From here he should have been able to see at least the chimney poking through the treetops. He crashed through the undergrowth and eventually found the track down to the house. At least the track was here, but now he knew he wouldn't see the house until he was almost on it. That, of course, was intentional. To keep both the track and the still well hidden from unwanted visitors. As he moved along the overgrown path, the smell of old burned wood was overpowering and brought him to a stop. He slapped at his head. Blaming the moonshine and the crazy Reverend, he gagged and spat into the soil, wiped his mouth and moved on. He broke out of the narrow trail through the undergrowth onto the main path. There was the house. His house. Mary's house. As wonderful as it had been when he left it. Dragging his throbbing leg, he made his way to the gate and in through the front door. He collapsed heavily into a chair in the kitchen and poured a glass of water from the pitcher on the table. Mary was coming in the back door to the kitchen as he arrived and looked in horror as she saw the state of him. I knew that would be too much for you, Zebediah Resnake. And a pointless trip it was too, right? You gone and bust yourself up all for a broken down still. Madness, that is, utter madness. Mary lectured him. Do you feel okay, Mary? Zebediah asked her, looking deep into her eyes. Of course I feel okay. Why shouldn't I feel okay? I'd feel a lot better if you'd stop with your stupid ideas, to go out and see the world all the time. That would make my day a lot simpler, wouldn't it? Yes, but you feel okay. That's what matters. You don't smell smoke, do you? Zebediah said. I lit the stove an hour ago, Zebediah. To cook the dinner you insisted I have ready for you. Maybe a little smoke, but no, it isn't unusual. Why? Mary replied. Oh, nothing. Nothing at all. You look wonderful. Come and give me a hug, baby. Zebediah said, smiling and reaching out to her. You'll get a hug then a bath before you get fed. Then you'll be promising me no more of these stupid trips. Mary scolded. Zebediah looked at her, and down at the table sheepishly. No more trips, dear. I think we have all we will ever need right here. Mary escorted Zebediah into the back room, and the big porcelain bath she proceeded to fill with jugs of hot water. Zebediah slid into the soapy bubbles and relaxed to her hands gently massaging his back. I love you, Mary. He told her, his eyes closed, trying to block out the words and the sights that plagued his mind. His Mary was right here, she was real as the water she poured over his head to wash away the soap she'd lathered his head with. He felt her touch, felt the water, felt the heat of it all. It had to be real. Mary brusquely washed his back, no playtime in the tub today, and left him to dry off. But he needed to feel her loving touch, and after making sure the baby was asleep, he pulled his wife into his arms and pulled her up so that her legs wrapped around his waist. Carrying her out into the hallway, Zebediah pushed Mary's body up against the wall. As their lips came together, passion instantly kindled into a heat that could not be tamed.
This scene has been censored to provide a safe and enjoyable reading experience for everyone.
No, his wife wasn't a ghost. She was real, and so was he. Zebediah let Mary's legs go, unpinning them from his waist as she slid down, her dress falling down to protect her modesty. Zebediah smoothed her hair, and she
censored
him, wrapping her small fingers around his wrist before she walked away, going down to finish supper. Zebediah went to their bedroom and took out the bottle of moonshine beneath the bed, sitting
censored
in the dark room as he took his first sip. No, they were all real, the moonshine was real, and the quilts his mother had made were real beneath him. The Reverend could
censored
off to the state insane asylum. Taking one more sip, Zebediah slipped down to the covers, needing to rest for just a little while. Chapter 8. Zebediah laid in bed, comfortable and confused. The Reverend was insane. There was no doubt at all in Zebediah's mind. Insane and cruel too. He had never spent any time with the church before he had been sent out to Nam, and now he felt it was with good reason. The stories never seemed to match with the people that were supposed to live it. He felt like a good guy. He tried to do the right thing. He couldn't balance the need somehow to prostrate himself at the hands of some preacher to admit he was really a bad person. He wasn't. Somehow, though, the Reverend didn't seem so good at all. He rolled over in the bed and slid his hand to where Mary was sleeping. She wasn't. He'd soon got used to the idea that when he woke, Mary wasn't there. He would always find her in the kitchen cooking breakfast or playing with the Joshua. Never in the bed. Some nights as he had tossed and turned, he had turned over to face Mary and seen something else. Something hideous. He had watched her beautiful fair hair and pale skin slowly collapse into gray dust. Fallen into crinkles of burned skin, and falling from her face and arms. He'd watched in shock and despair as she slowly crumbled into dust and disappeared. Behind her she left just a smell of burned timber. He would shake his head and rub his eyes and she would be there again. His gentle sweet bride. Beautiful, youthful and elegant. He knew his head was torn. He assumed his mind was torn too. The morning would always come, and the day with Mary would always be perfect. The Reverend was a crazy man. Short on clients, and loaded with any way possible to drag in new recruits. That was all, thought Zebediah. He wanted a new convert. A new money supply. Plus he knew Zebediah could make the good hooch. That was all. Get the guy weak. Fill his head and get some of the good stuff cheap. Zebediah pulled himself from the cocoon of his bed and went down to the kitchen, where Mary, as ever, was making him breakfast. "Good morning, Princess. I thought I might have worn you out last night. Thought you might still be in the bed with me?" Zebediah said. "It was wonderful, baby. But I slept like a log, and you do need to get your strength up. So I need to make breakfast for my man." Mary smiled as she placed a large plate of bacon and eggs in front of him. "But you're doing okay, right?" Zebediah asked. "Yes, my love. I'm doing just fine. So are you, until you go running around out there," Mary said, pointing to the door. "We're all good then," Zebediah said, as he dug into the breakfast. He was desperate to ask her about the Reverend, and thought he might mention the graves he'd seen when he was swimming in the creek. They weren't there though, he thought. How could he tell her about the things he'd seen without her getting angry and being more determined to keep him home? Best to keep it quiet, he decided. The Reverend was mad as a box of frogs, just as Mary had said before, and the session in the creek was just the painkillers and a bad head episode was all. No need to bother her with that rubbish. As the days moved on, Zebediah noticed Mary would disappear for long periods. She obviously wasn't going to town, and there was very little in the woods that might draw her attention, but when he searched through the house he would never find her, or Joshua for that matter. Everything in the house would be perfect. Clean, tidy, just perfect. So he could see no reason for her to be anywhere. He would begin calling her name, and in an instant she would appear, usually somewhere behind him. She would be smiling and calm, and always asked what the problem was, but it was unnerving. He would shrug it off. She was a woman. Women were confusing at the best of times, he would assure himself. Today, though, Zebediah really was going to climb the track to the old moonshine still. He convinced Mary, and even asked her to join him. She declined with a look of suspicion and concern, but allowed him to go and seek out the old still. The walk up the winding path was now strange. It had been so long since he'd been up here, it had become almost unfamiliar territory. But as he emerged into the tiny clearing, Zebediah heaved a gentle sigh. Here his pa had spent hours brewing some of the best moonshine in the state, and they had all benefited from the profits. The only people that didn't appreciate good moonshine were of course the revenue men. They knew just as well as most folk in this area that Pa Snake was brewing the best shine around. Sadly for them, he was always a step ahead. They never caught him moving it. They never caught him selling it, and more importantly, they never found his still. It wasn't that they hadn't tried, of course. They had. Just that Pa was a better moonshiner than they were revenue men. Of course it helped that most of the local police were Pa customers too, Zebediah remembered. As Zebediah wandered around, he noted the large copper tank and the corkscrew piping leading to it. Hidden in the undergrowth was the old supply of barrels and mason jars of different sizes. Zebediah smiled as he thought back to when he would stand at the end of the pipe, waiting for the first drops of the precious liquid to fall from the pipe. His father would be standing beside him, making sure his young son didn't go gulping down that first jar full. "Nope, we always toss that one, son. In that barrel over there. Might make a fine fuel for the truck, but won't do much good to a man's insides, and I won't be seeing too many customers selling him that stuff." Zebediah smiled as he picked his way through the old equipment, and thinking back to his father using it all effortlessly out here in this little hideaway. He taught Zebediah all he knew, both about the brewing of the shine and the secret to staying in business. "This place is nobody's business but ours, son. Remember that. The only folk that need to know about this place is me, and now you. Anybody ever asks, you know nothing about this place, and even less about shine, okay?" His father had said sternly. The young Zebediah had nodded and agreed, feeling honored and special to be entrusted with a secret so great. The equipment was here, and with a bit of a cleanup and a bit of effort, Zebediah was pretty sure he could get this old still back up and running again. He hadn't any plans to go back to town anytime soon, and had no real idea how he would find customers, but it was good to know he could at least enjoy the stuff for himself. A few sips of good shine would always remind him of his pa. Worth it just for that anyhow, whether he sold any or not, he thought. He settled himself down on an old barrel, and enjoyed the afternoon sunshine as it speckled through the tree canopy. Some days life just got better, and the rest of the world was of no matter, he thought. All he needed was here. His beautiful wife, Mary. His son, Joshua. A fine little homestead, and soon a working moonshine still. Yep, life was indeed good for Zebediah. Chapter 9. The old truck rattled into Charles Station and pulled up at the small diner. Cherokee Joe eased himself out of the passenger seat and leaned back inside to grab his small pack. "I'm mighty grateful for the ride, my friend. It is much appreciated," Cherokee Joe said. "'Bout best I can do for ya, Joe. Good luck finding your friend. I'll be on my way. Hopefully be eating my wife's deer stew before sundown, son. Are you sure you wouldn't rather come the rest of the trip? Don't seem to be much in this one-horse town to hang around for. That's if it's the place you're actually looking for anyways," the driver of the truck said to Cherokee Joe. "No, this will do just fine. His address is on the letters I'm bringing him. Get yourself off and enjoy the stew." "Thank you again," Cherokee Joe said as he slammed the truck door closed. The driver gave a wave and drove off through the town and off into the distance. Cherokee Joe opened the door to the grocery store, stepped in and selected himself a stool at the small table. "Not seen you around these parts, friend. What can I get you?" the woman said as she scurried from behind the counter, clutching a pad. "Just a coffee, please. And some information if you have it," Cherokee Joe replied. "Information, eh? Well, you sure don't look like a cop, but then we don't get big city cops round here anyways. I'll get your coffee," the woman replied as she made her way back around the counter to the coffee pot. "So what information would that be exactly?" she asked as she poured the coffee. "I'm not a cop, ma'am. I'm just looking for a friend. Got something of his I wanted to return to him. Zebediah Resnake. He's supposed to live around these parts, one believe," Cherokee Joe said. The woman placed the coffee in front of Cherokee Joe and sat down opposite him. "Oh, Zebediah, indeed. And how would you be knowing Zebediah?" she asked. "We served together, ma'am. In Vietnam. Zebediah got sent home before me, due to his injuries. I have some letters of his," Cherokee Joe replied. "Well, I think whatever happened to that boy done messed with his head. He was talking all kinds of nonsense when I last saw him. I heard from the preacher too," she said, leaning across the table to Joe and lowering her voice to a whisper. "The poor boy thinks he's living with his wife and child up at the old Resnake place. Well, I tell you, that old place is a burned-down ruin, and his wife and baby are 6 feet under. So is his mother. Now we done told him all of that, but he won't hear a word of it. So we guess he's living up in the old ruin, all by his lonesome," she said. "Real sad. He was such a nice boy before he left for the war, you know? Always had clean hands when he came in here. Well, as I said, he's probably living in the ruins up there. Unless of course he's found a shack or something on his papa's moonshine still. Nobody knows where that is though. It's up there somewhere well hid. Nobody here knows where old Resnake made his hooch, and he sure wasn't going to tell no one. Made the best damn shine in the whole state, did his pa. Don't know a man in this town that hasn't spent a night with his head in the water trough after drinking some of Resnake's shine." Cherokee Joe smiled and took the woman's hand across the table. She looked confused at his forward gesture but relaxed her hand in his, feeling almost swept up in this large man's magnetic gaze. "Yes, ma'am. That is the Zebediah Resnake I'm looking for. Would you be kind enough to tell me where to find him? Directions to the burned-down house, perhaps? I'm sure if he's up there I'll find him, Cherokee Joe said. The woman giggled and blushed as she removed her hand and stood up. Why yes, you Indians can do all that tracking stuff, right? Well, I don't know if you can do any good for the boy, but I won't keep you from trying. Go back out of town and follow the left fork that leads up the side of the mountain. Was never much of a road, just an old cart track. Just keep going till you see the burned-down house. There's only one up there. Can't help you with the still, of course. As I said, nobody knows where old Resnake had that hidden. Cherokee Joe thanked the woman and dropped some change on the table for the coffee. He stepped out of the shop and made his way out of the town in search of the track to the house. Looking around the little town, he could understand why Zebediah had always talked about his life up in the hills. The place was desolate and miserable. A couple of run-down stores and a gas station, and of course the little grocery store he'd just left. Nope, Zebediah was no city boy, but this was no city either. He found the track soon enough, and began a slow, leisurely walk up to the house. He enjoyed the peace, and could understand how Zebediah might prefer a place up here than down in the town. The undergrowth was growing heavy by the side of the track, and Cherokee Joe was happy to find a handful of berries on the way. He stopped to pick a handful, before noticing he was being watched. He turned slowly to face the copperhead snake on the other side of the track. He lowered himself to the ground and began eating the berries one at a time. These are good berries, Cherokee Joe said to the snake. I wasn't expecting to find them so soon in the year. I'd share them, but I don't think you'd be too keen, my friend. The snake gazed blankly at him, its head slowly following the movement of his hand as Joe fed the berries into his mouth. I guess you are enjoying the peace here too, now the people are gone. They did attract a good supply of food for you though, right? Plenty of rats and mice where people make their mess, Cherokee Joe said. I have work to do, my friend. As I'm sure you will when you've enjoyed the sun some more. Relax. The snake coiled itself calmly without taking its eyes off the big Indian, and then slowly uncoiled and spread itself out in the warm sunlight. Cherokee Joe smiled as he got back to his feet and continued up the track. He made good progress up the hill and could see the house not far beyond. As the woman in the store had said, it was a burned-out ruin. Not a place anyone could live in, except perhaps a former vet with a serious head injury. Or something else. Perhaps something else was closer to the truth of all this, he thought as he moved closer. Zebediah had picked up a couple of large mason jars from the still, and some lengths of copper piping. He really didn't have any idea what he was going to do with them, but he felt it attached him to the still. Gave him a reason to return and get it running again. Or maybe Mary could use them as pickle jars for the coming winter. They were too good to leave laying around up there anyway, he'd thought, as he staggered back with them, pleased with his haul. He was almost at the gate to the house, when he saw the large, tall figure silhouetted on the path, heading towards the house. He lowered the jars and pipe to the ground, and stared at the oncoming visitor. Joe? Joe? Cherokee Joe. Is that really you? Zebediah yelled, as he broke into an almost trot down the road. Cherokee Joe gave a big wave with both arms in the air. Hey Razor, my friend. Good to see you again, he shouted back. He was looking all the time at the ruins of the house and the approaching Zebediah as they met. They hugged, shook hands, and stood back to look at each other. Good to see you got back in one piece, Joe. Was worried for you, man. Every day there is a day you might lose a piece of something important, Zebediah said. Well, it looks like this country living has got you back up and running too, Razor. Got yourself a still, I see, Cherokee Joe said, pointing to the jars and the copper tubing. Oh hell, well I will have soon enough. Got to get all the pieces back together, you know. Don't you go telling nobody though? Top secret stuff is this. Zebediah chuckled. Now you got to come inside and meet my wife and little Joshua. I told them all about you. Mary had appeared at the other side of the gate. She was smiling, but looking curious at the tall Indian. Cherokee Joe gazed at her and slid the battered baseball cap from his long dark hair. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Mary," Cherokee Joe said. "You need to come inside, Joe. We don't stand on ceremony here. Come and meet my son," Zebediah said. "Yes, Joe, please do come in," said Mary without moving from the spot she was standing in, and looking directly in his eyes almost as a challenge. "Do come into our wonderful home." "I certainly will, ma'am. But, could you give me a moment with your husband? I have come a long way, and this is sort of military-type stuff, you know? I'm sure you understand. Then I would love to come and see your son and your fine house," Cherokee Joe said. "Very well," Mary said. She turned and retreated to the house with a glare at Zebediah. Cherokee Joe put an arm round Zebediah's shoulder and turned him towards the creek. "Let's go down there for a while. I need to talk to you for a moment and give you something. Then we'll go in, okay?" he said. Zebediah looked confused as he followed Cherokee Joe down to the edge of the creek. "So what's this all about, Joe? What you got for me?" Zebediah asked. "Sit a while, Razor. I'm going to have a smoke. Here are the letters you left in Nam. I thought you might like them back," Cherokee Joe said. "Oh right, hey thanks. I appreciate that, man. That's a long damn way to bring a guy his mail though. You could have just posted them." "Is there a problem?" Zebediah asked. "I could have posted them, sure. But I wanted to come see my old buddy. We went through a lot together. Wanted to see you were doing okay. You know, Razor. Things aren't always as they seem, yeah? Sometimes the world just ain't nothing like we think it is. Nothing at all like we think it is," Joe replied. "Well, no. We been stood in the pits of hell over there, man. Watched women and kids turn to ashes in front of our eyes. Watched our own men blown to pieces with bits of body flying over our heads. No way folk here would believe that sort of shit could ever happen in real life. Not here anyhow. No point in telling these folk anything like that. They all think it's just for TV," Zebediah replied. "And now you found you some kind of paradise away from all that, my friend. A beautiful young wife, a son and a sweet house to keep them in. Almost like a dream come true for you, I reckon," Cherokee Joe replied. He had lit a pipe he had already filled, and was drawing on it deeply. Thick gray smoke drifted lazily around his head. "Well, yeah. What you saying, Joe? You don't think I should have a bit of paradise after the shit I went through? The injuries I picked up?" Zebediah replied. Cherokee Joe turned and smiled at Zebediah. He took a long deep drag on the pipe, and as he exhaled he took a hip flask from his bag. He took off the top and took a long drink before taking another long draw on the pipe. "How are your injuries? I saw what happened to you that day. You look fitter than any of the guys in town that never saw more than an Audie Murphy war movie. How are you feeling now?" Joe asked. "I never felt better. I've been to town a couple of times and that was a bit too much, but Mary here keeps me fed and takes good care of me. I feel real good here, man. Yeah, sometimes I feel like it never happened at all, you know?" Zebediah replied. "Sure. That's good. How about we go meet your wife and kid, Razor? She'll be getting worried about us down here," Cherokee Joe said as he stood up. They walked together in silence back to the house. Mary was standing back at the gate, and Zebediah noticed the look of shock on her face as she saw them approach. "Nothing to be alarmed about, baby. Nobody died. Joe here just brought me the letters I dropped when I got shot. He needed a smoke of his pipe too, and I guess he thought it might upset you. It didn't smell too bad, to be honest," Zebediah said. Mary smiled and moved into the house. "No, I'm not worried at all, darling. Please come in, Joe. Make yourself at home." They all went into the kitchen and sat at the table. "Coffee? Beer? I think Zebediah still has some of his moonshine left, if he hasn't been sneaking in and drank it all," Mary said. A beer will be just fine, thank you, Mary. Joe replied. Mary busied herself around the kitchen as Zebediah and Joe reminisced about their time back in Vietnam. Mary brought them both a beer and then proceeded to put together supper. I'm guessing you can stay for supper, Joe? I don't think you have a choice, really. There's nowhere else around here you can stay the night, is there? Mary said. Yes, I would love to stay for supper. Cherokee Joe replied, sipping on the cold beer. Why don't you go upstairs and bring Joshua down to see Joe, Zebediah? He might need changing, but I'm sure you'll manage. Mary said. Zebediah smiled and stood up. Of course. You've yet to meet Razor Jr. I won't be long. Get Joe another beer, please, darling, and I'll go get Joshua. As Mary watched Zebediah go through the kitchen door and heard him climb the stairs, she passed a new beer to Joe. What's going on, Joe? You can see me. You can see this house. Who are you? Mary asked. Relax, Mary, I'm a friend. You need help, and more importantly, your husband needs the truth. Joe replied. He will know the truth. He just isn't ready yet. I plan on telling him when the time is right. Just not yet. Don't you go messing this up, Cherokee Joe, or whoever you are. This is none of your business. Mary snapped. Who the hell are you? I'm actually called John Longfeathers at home. Cherokee, obviously, so the army being the way it is, I got tagged with Cherokee Joe. My father was a medicine man, as was his father and his father before him. I learned things from him, but the time of the medicine man has passed. He did teach me how to walk with the dead, though. Seemed I was a natural for that as a child. And you, Mary, of course, are dead. But you can see the house, everything. How can that be? Mary asked. The herbs. In my pipe and in my flask. It will wear off soon enough. I can't keep it up forever. But neither can you, Mary. You will get weaker. It will become harder. Zebediah needs to know what is going on. Are you going to tell him, or shall I? I might have a better idea than either of us telling him. Let me go outside for a smoke, and I will consider it. Cherokee Joe said. Mary stood back as he got up from the table. He could see in her face she was terrified. Terrified of losing everything she had put together. Terrified of Zebediah learning the truth. She had to trust Cherokee Joe to get this right. But how? As Zebediah came into the kitchen with Joshua in his arms, he spun around looking for his friend. Where'd Joe go, Mary? You didn't scare him off, did you? Zebediah said. Mary looked at him, her eyes down and almost tearful. No, honey, I don't think anything could scare that man. He's gone out to smoke. He'll be back soon enough. Mary said. Oh, heck, woman. It don't smell that bad. He could have smoked it just fine in here. Zebediah said. It was his choice, dear. He thought it might be bad for Joshua, perhaps, so he went outside. Mary replied. Well, okay. How about you pass us a couple more beers? Better yet, I'll break out the shine. It's damn good to have my buddy around. Real good. Nice fella, isn't he? Zebediah said. Yes, Zeb, honey. He's a fine man. Like no other I've ever met. Yes, get your moonshine, baby. I think tonight might be a good night for it. Mary said. Zebediah passed Mary the baby and went into the bottom of the larder. Hiding in the bottom, under an old towel, was a large jar of moonshine. He dragged it out and plonked it on the sink. He reached for a couple of glasses and placed them on the table just as Cherokee Joe walked back into the kitchen. Perfect timing, Joe. Sit yourself down and try a glass of paw clear nectar. Finest drink you'll ever taste. Zebediah said. Cherokee Joe lowered himself into a chair and took the glass. Here's to you, Zebediah, and your new wife and child. He looked over at Mary, who was staring back at him as he made the toast. You know what you forgot, Mary? You know what Zebediah should really have. What would that be, Joe? Mary asked nervously. Well, the one thing a returning hero should always have when he gets home. A homecoming party. Cherokee Joe said, smiling. Mary shuffled uncomfortably at the sink as she glared at Cherokee Joe. A homecoming, Joe? Hey, let me tell you, man, I spent enough time in that town since I got back to know they are the last people I want around my house. Mary and Joshua is all I need for a homecoming, Zebediah said. I hear you, Razor. But I think between Mary and myself, we could pull a few people together you might like to spend an evening with. Isn't that right, Mary? Cherokee Joe replied. Well, Mary said, if you think that's what Zebediah needs, then perhaps I could arrange something. Why don't you boys fill up those glasses and take them to the creek? You can have a smoke and a chat while I see to Joshua. Yes? Sounds like a good idea, Mary. Come on, Razor. Top us up and let's go make up some war stories. Cherokee Joe said, smiling at Mary. Well, sure. But like I said, I got all the folk I need right here, right now. I don't need any more homecoming than what I already got, okay? Zebediah said. They stood up as Zebediah refilled the glasses and made their way outside. The sun was just short of setting now, and long shadows curled over the mountains and under the trees. A golden glow set the creek sparkling in a rainbow of colors as they made their way down and settled on the grass. Cherokee Joe took out his pipe and slowly filled it from a pouch in his pocket. As Zebediah lit himself a cigarette, Joe gently tugged on the pipe. You got a good woman there, Razor. A good woman and a fine son. But I got to tell you, my friend, life is stranger than you can ever imagine. After all you've been through, you need to know it can get a whole lot stranger. Cherokee Joe said as he set down the pipe and took a sip of the moonshine. He savored it as he stared across the glowing water of the creek. Stranger? How stranger? What you talking about, Joe? That shine gone to your head already? As you said, I got a fine wife and a fine son. I got all I need in this world, Joe. The rest of 'em can all go do one. I don't need any part of that world no more. Zebediah replied. Well, let's get back to the house. Maybe Mary is ready to surprise us with some of that fine cooking, or maybe something else. Cherokee Joe said. They returned to the kitchen, where Mary was waiting for them. She was again stood at the kitchen sink looking fretful. I guess this is it then, Mary said, clutching her hands together tightly. I hope you're right about this, Joe. Cherokee Joe nodded to her in encouragement. Zebediah, darling. Shall we go through to the front room? I have something of a surprise for you. Joe helped organize it. Mary continued. E8? How could Joe organize anything? You only just met. What you all been messing around at, hey? Zebediah replied. Your homecoming, sweetheart. We secretly organized your homecoming. Yes, it's a surprise. Please go on through to the sitting room, Mary said, leading them through the front hall to the room opposite. It was a room they barely ventured into. A dining room table with chairs and a couple of comfy chairs at the walls were surrounded by plate shelves loaded with years of ornaments and bric-a-brac. Nothing of any value and not much of any use. Most of it had been collected by Zebediah's mother. The room was kept tidy but left shut. They were happier to sit in the kitchen, eating and chatting through the day. No need for a sitting room at all, really, except for those few occasions. Tonight seemed to be one. Mary stepped into the room and turned to face Zebediah. Welcome home, my darling. We are all so glad you got home safe. A cheer and clapping started as Zebediah entered the room. Sitting at the top of the table was his father with a huge cheerful grin on his face. He stood up and applauded as Zebediah entered the room. Beside him, Zebediah's mother. She was clapping with glee as she made her way around the table to Zebediah. And standing at the door end of the table, within touching distance of Zebediah, was Jethro Mullen. Jethro reached out and gave Zebediah a huge hug, just as his mother was closing on him. She too joined the pair and hugged her son. Zebediah was in a whirl. He swayed as he looked round the room at all the faces. All faces he knew, and all people he knew to be dead. That was one thing he did know. Every last one of these people were dead. Except Lieutenant Simpson. He wasn't dead. Why was he here? He gazed at the smiling face of the lieutenant, and mouthed, "You too, Lieutenant? You dead too?" Lieutenant Simpson nodded, and moved over to join Jethro and Zebediah's mother. "Bought it one day before I was due to ship home. Won't believe this razor, but it was one of our own damn gunships blew me away. The same damn chopper I'd called in to take out a machine gun. Came right over us and sawed through me like I was a log at the sawmill. Good to see you, son. Happy homecoming." As he felt his legs slowly giving way, and his head beginning to spin, he felt the strong arms of Cherokee Joe take his weight and lower him gently into a chair. As he looked around, all he could see were a swirl of familiar faces moving in and out of focus. All wishing him a happy homecoming and welcome home. He closed his eyes and lowered his head. "Well, John Longfeathers. That isn't quite what you planned, was it?" Mary snapped. Cherokee Joe looked back at her smiling, and looked down at Zebediah. "Nothing is ever as planned. But now he knows, and that was the plan. He has people here that he loved and felt secure with. This is the only way he will ever understand Mary." Cherokee Joe said, "Give him a slug of my sipping whiskey. That'll bring him around. If it don't send him sleeping for the next 100 years. Zebediah's father laughed. "Yes, I think perhaps a drink might knock off some of the shock." "Poor dear." Zebediah's mother replied. Cherokee Joe tilted back Zebediah's head and gently eased a glass of moonshine to his lips. He tipped it into his mouth. Zebediah gulped and sat upright, his eyes wide and scanning the room. He knew what scared was. He'd been scared as a child, and sometimes on Halloween he'd been absolutely terrified at the older kids' trick-or-treat costumes. He'd seen horrors in Vietnam that woke him up at night shaking in fear. Real terror. Yes, he guessed he knew real terror. But now, he was sitting in his living room with a group of people he knew were dead. Really dead. The only people alive here were himself, Joe, and of course his wife and son. Everyone else in this room was dead. He'd even seen Jethro blown into pieces. Dead was the only place that guy would ever be. All dead. "Mama? Pa? You're dead. I know that. This is just a dream, right? Or am I missing something? Am I dead too?" Zebediah asked pitifully at his mother. She sat down beside him. "It's time for some truths, baby. Time now you knew what is going on. Your friend Joe here came at just the right time to try to make things right with you. Yes, I'm dead. Heart attack. That letter I wrote you wasn't true, son. I was angry as all. Mary was taking over the house and getting it ready for you and little Joshua. I kept nagging at her. Kept getting in her face. Poor girl couldn't do right for doing wrong in my eyes. Well, we had a fight. I threw things and Mary tried to stop me. I didn't know I'd knocked one of the oil lamps over in the kitchen. This old place was dry as a bone and went up like a 4th of July firework. Your sweet wife tried to stop the fire from spreading and was trying to get me and the baby outside. I fell. I was old, son. Too old to get away. My poor heart gave way. Mary and the baby died on top of me. The house just fell right in on them. I'm so sorry I sent that letter, son. Mary was a good girl, and she loved you more than anything in the world." Zebediah's mother said. Zeb? Mary said as she took his head in her hands. "I just wanted you to have a wonderful home to come back to, darling. I'm so sorry. This isn't lying, honey. It was the only way I could keep us together. But Joe is right. It gets harder with each passing day." "Harder? How do you mean harder? What gets harder?" Zebediah asked. "She means her power to keep you enchanted. The power to keep this illusion of the house and everything in it together. There is very little time left for her. It is incredible she has held it together this long. Cherokee Joe said. So she's a ghost, you mean? They are all ghosts. I've been tricked into believing all this is real. So what happens now? They all disappear. I'm left sitting in a ruin? What, Joe? What? Zebediah snapped. Are you real? Or are you one of them? He finished as he scanned around the room at the now silent faces looking back at him. Well, perhaps tricked isn't quite how it happened. Mary didn't exactly choose to do this. Cherokee Joe replied. She didn't? Then some evil spirit thought they'd play a practical joke on a cripple? Zebediah replied. No, not at all. Quite the opposite. Love did it. Even dead, Mary couldn't stop her love, and it was so powerful it created this. You were all she ever wanted in life, and all she ever wanted in death. There was nothing evil involved, just an immense outpouring of all her soul into this one place. Cherokee Joe replied. Then why does it have to end? If you all leave, why can't I just carry on with my wife and child? This illusion is better than any life I saw down in the town. We can manage just fine here without anyone. Zebediah said. I can't, Zeb darling. I don't know why, but I can feel it getting weaker. I know you saw me disappear sometimes. I know you saw me in bed falling to pieces. It wasn't a dream, honey. I just couldn't always hold it together. Soon I won't be able to hold it together at all. Joshua and me will be gone forever, and you will be left in this ruin of a house alone. I'm sorry, darling. I gave you a false hope. I gave myself a false hope. But Joe is right. It's coming to an end. Mary said. So how do we fix it? Zebediah asked. I can't live in this place without you, Mary. I can't do it. I'll kill myself before I let you go again. He dropped his head in his hands, and for the first time he could remember as an adult, he wept great sobbing tears. He sobbed, and feeling the hands of his mother on his shoulders didn't ease the pain. Don't go talking of killing yourself, Zebediah. You're my son, and I gave you life. It is a wrong and evil thing to give away such a precious gift, for whatever reason. Even love, my son. Zebediah's mother whispered, as he hugged his sobbing head. Zebediah sat himself upright, his face red from the tears. He reached for the glass of moonshine in front of him, and started drinking. Go easy on that, son. That's not the cheap stuff. His father chided. Pa, if a man ever needed a drink, I think round about now might be the time, right? Zebediah replied. Well, I can't say as you're wrong there, son, but just take it easy and let's think things through. There's an answer somewhere. Might not be right obvious, and might not be what we expect, but it'll be there. Ain't that right, young Injun? Cherokee Joe looked across at Zebediah's father. I think we all know the answer. All of us here know the answer. How we deliver the answer is the problem. I am neither wise enough nor brave enough to put it forward. Zebediah turned to face Cherokee Joe. You mean I need to kill myself, Joe, is that it? Kill myself, and we can be together forever and proper? Is that what you mean, Joe? Well, Ma said I wasn't going to kill myself. Now, I don't know much about ghosts, but I have a sneaky feeling none of these folk here are able to kill me. Am I right? Cherokee Joe nodded, and a murmur of agreement went around the room. So? If I can't kill myself and these folk here can't kill me, then all that's left is you, Joe. You got to kill me. Can you do it, Joe? Can you kill your buddy so he can spend the rest of eternity with his wife and kid? Zebediah said, reaching back for the moonshine. I have seen a lot of men die, Razor. A lot. And I've killed my share too. But they would have killed me if I hadn't. I see them every night the same as you do. But kill my friend? No. That is not something I could ever close my eyes to. I would never be able to sleep again. Cherokee Joe said. Then I have to do it myself. Zebediah said, as he gulped down the last of the moonshine and smashed the jar on the table. In his hand he held a long, menacing sliver of the broken jar. It glinted in his hand as he began to lower it to his wrist. "No. Stop," Zebediah's mother yelled as she hugged him tight around his.
Censored.
"Ma, please. It's the only option I have." Zebediah snapped back. "I don't think it is an option, son. Far from it. I think it could ruin everything you had or might have," his mother said. "What? Why? I think we already said the only way for us to be together was to die. I can't have Joe do it, so the only way I can do it is to do it myself. You understand that, right? I just want this over with. I just want to be with Mary and my child. It's okay for you. You're with Pa. Just let me do it," Zebediah said. "No, son, it's not that. Look around you. See anybody here that killed themselves? We don't know what happens to folk that commit suicide. We just don't know. There's a chance you won't come back to us at all. If you stay alive, we know we'll be seeing you again sometime. If you die, then we'll be having a proper homecoming for you. But die by your own hand, son, and we just don't know. If it isn't here, then where? Wherever it is, it will be for eternity, so think on it, son, please," Zebediah's mother begged. "She's right, son. Dyin' sure ain't like livin'. It's complicated to explain, and so easy to understand once you're here. Not that that makes much of a lot of sense to you right now. But no, we don't know what happens to folk that go take their own life. But if you are wanting to be with Mary and the babe, then you need to think on what your ma said to you, son." Zebediah's dad chipped in as he poured himself a glass from a newly opened mason jar. The crowd around the room were all nodding and muttering in agreement. "Pass me a glass of that, please, Pa. I'm starting to feel a mite thirsty for some of it right now," Zebediah said as he pushed his empty glass towards his father. He turned to Cherokee Joe, who was standing off to one side observing the conversation. "Joe?" his eyes implored as he looked towards his friend. Cherokee Joe shuffled on the spot, then leaned forward to the table. "I think I will need a glass of that too, Mr. Resnake, sir. I don't think even my father or my grandfather would believe what I'm witnessing now. Sure, we talked it through, and yes, they danced with the spirits. We knew it was for a moment, and we knew without the smoke and the herbs it wasn't going to happen. We had to believe it, or it was all just illusion. This is an illusion I'm struggling to take in too. I always knew you were real. I always knew I could walk among you as my ancestors did. I just didn't expect it ever to be as real as it is now. Your father would be proud of you, Joe. Let me top up that glass for you," Zebediah's father said as he reached over again to top up the tall man's glass. "Tonight we need an answer, and I believe Joe here might have it." Chapter 10. I think it's time me and you took a walk outside, Razor. I need myself a smoke," Cherokee Joe said. As Zebediah stood up and made his way to the door, Cherokee Joe turned to Mary. "Once we're outside, could you give us reality back for a while?" Mary nodded. "Are you sure you know what you're doing, Joe?" she asked. "I'm sure of nothing, Mary. This is way bigger than anything I've ever experienced. I'm just working on the hopes that your love for each other will make it work. You understand? Love him, and be ready for him returning," Cherokee Joe said as he turned and followed Zebediah out of the door. "Let's sit and talk a while, Razor. Your mind is in a strange place. You have your world in a tangle of confusion. Before we go further, you need to understand that. You need to understand that you are still the one in control, and the one that can pull this together. Only you," Cherokee Joe said. "I took a bullet to the head, Joe. I'm insane. Tonight, I drank enough whiskey to sink a battleship. How the hell you think I'm going to sort any of this, let alone make any sense of it?" Zebediah replied. They set themselves down on a fallen tree, overlooking the creek. Far in the distance, the lights of other homesteads were lit up. The hills opposite were spotted with the faint glow of other families having other meetings about other issues. All so far away tonight. None of them would be able to help Zebediah with his issues anyway. Perhaps from over there, folk could see a light shining from the house. Perhaps not. Zebediah turned around to look at his home. It was gone. He and Cherokee Joe were sat with their backs to nothing but a burned-out ruin. He shuddered. Am I insane, Joe? Is that the truth of all this? Zebediah asked. You want me to tell you it's all normal? You had a bang on the head, and if it gets better, all this will go away? I can't tell you that, my friend. I spent some short time learning to talk to my ancestors, accepting their wisdom when I had questions. But this? Nothing like this. This is real Razor. This the most incredible power of love. Nothing I have seen could prepare me for this. Only you can answer it, my friend. Cherokee Joe said. Zebediah turned back to look at the ruined house. The moon had risen full, and bathed the burned and charred remains in a silent silver glow. How could he have ever lived in this place all this time without knowing? His head was throbbing, and he knew it wasn't the moonshine he'd been drinking. He could feel the scar on his head was livid and sore. His leg, too,
censored,
in pain, and he could barely move his arm. Without this, I will fall apart, Joe. She's kept me healthy and healing, right? Somehow she was fixing my wounds. Zebediah said. Somehow, yes. And yes, without it, you will start to feel the pain of the reality she has spared you. Sure, your wounds will heal over time, but you'll be a cripple until that head wound slowly kills you, I think. If it doesn't kill you physically, it will kill you mentally. There is only one way out of this, but you know that. Cherokee Joe replied. I think perhaps we should walk a while. Let you feel your body as it really is, and let you learn how your mind will respond to the real world. Just a short walk, Razor. We'll take our time. He stood up, and Zebediah followed, now leaning heavily on his cane. They started walking down the track that led to town. Zebediah was slow. He felt every step now, and the pain pulsed through his body to gritted teeth. They hadn't gone too far down the track when Cherokee Joe stopped and looked back at Zebediah. He gave a gentle smile. Let's finish this moonshine, Razor, he said, holding a mason jar up in his hand. Then you can go on ahead on your own for a while, okay? Sure, I'm about ready for a drink, Joe, Zebediah said, reaching for the jar. He took a long, hard swallow of the liquid and gasped. It burned, but not nearly as bad as the pain had been burning from his wounds. The liquor felt good. Damn good, he thought, as he took another hit before handing the jar back to Cherokee Joe. He watched as the tall Indian took a big swallow himself. Okay, Razor, my friend. This is as far as I'm going with you. This is a journey you and only you can make. I shall be waiting for you, have no fear. Cherokee Joe said. You think I'll find the answers down there, Joe? I'm not sure this body can go much further than it has already, Zebediah replied. No, not too much further. But yes, I think the answer is waiting for you down there. Cherokee Joe said. Joe? I understand what you said back at the house about you killing me. Or rather, not killing me. I don't want to put that on your conscience, man. Zebediah said. No, I will be standing here waiting for you, Razor. I won't be killing you. Cherokee Joe replied. Zebediah gave the big man a huge hug with his good arm, and turned to face back down the road. Stepping off, he looked back to see his friend watch him go. He could see in the moonlight that there were tears on the big man's face, and he braced himself and continued his journey. With each step down the road, Zebediah could feel the pain in his body getting worse and worse. He placed the weight on his bad leg gingerly, and held himself up with a tight grip on his cane. His arm,
censored,
as it tried to compensate for the weakness in his leg. It too was damaged enough and was feeling every step. Zebediah kept his eyes forward down the road and kept stepping forward, though he knew not to where. His trust in Joe right now was all that kept him moving. His trust in Joe and his deep love for Mary and Joshua. He had to go on. Somewhere on this journey he would find the answer. He had been hobbling for what seemed like hours, but he knew must only have been some 15 minutes. He needed a break, a drink, and a chance to let his leg and his arm ease up from the pressure. Just 2 minutes sat on the trackside would do, he thought. He lowered himself to the ground and reached around for a cigarette in his pocket. He growled as he put the cigarette to his mouth and lit it. The pain in his leg didn't ease, and he pushed it out into the road to take off some pressure. He felt the piercing sting in his leg in an instant. He knew it wasn't his wound. He knew he had been bitten. The pain roared up his leg, and he groaned deeply, the cigarette falling from his lips as he rolled over onto the track. He was lying on his back, groaning as he looked up into the night sky at the full clear moon shining down on him. He felt bathed in its light. The stinging pain of the bite was taking hold as he saw the dark shape rise beside his head. The mouth of the copperhead was open wide as it snapped forward and bit down deep into his neck. Zebediah had seen the piercing eyes looking into his as it struck. No malevolence or evil. Just smooth efficiency. The warm silky skin of the snake pressed hard against the skin of his neck as it forced the fangs deeper and deeper to pump its deadly venom into his system. Zebediah could feel the venom injecting into his jugular, burning hot. His throat was closing, and he was gasping for the cool night air. The gasps came quicker and shallower as his throat closed tighter and tighter. He was paralyzed with pain and could barely move his head, but heard the gentle swish of the snake sliding back into the undergrowth. Above him, the moon continued to shine down gently on the deathly event. Zebediah knew he didn't have long. He had nothing but respect for snakes and understood them well. Killing a man was not something they would ever want to do if they could avoid it. The venom they produced was enough to kill their prey, and a man was too big to eat. Wasting all that venom in defense would mean there was nothing left to kill dinner with. Zebediah also knew the venom was potent, and the bite to the leg had been just a warning. The bite to the neck was the killer. 15 minutes maybe. Time to smoke a cigarette, say a prayer or iron a shirt, but not time for anything after that. The body would slowly close down, and the internal organs would give up. No doctor could save him now. Even if a doctor had been stood beside him, he couldn't be saved without anti-venom anyhow. Zebediah was dying, and he knew it. He also knew he hadn't killed himself. He hadn't expected to die, and Joe had said quite clearly he wouldn't be doing the job either. This had to be the answer Joe was talking about. This had to be the way he could stay with Mary and Joshua for eternity. It had to be the way, didn't it? Chapter 11. As Zebediah lay dying in the middle of the track, the moon still shining over him, another dark shadow fell over him. This one enveloped him and blotted out the sky, and he could feel the strong hands of Cherokee Joe hauling him up. "Let's get you home, Razor. Your family is waiting, I reckon," Cherokee Joe said. Cherokee Joe lifted the dying Zebediah up onto his back and began the slow walk to the burned-out ruin. Zebediah was fading into unconsciousness, but his mind was screaming, and he tried to mouth the words. "Don't save me, Joe. Please, not now. Don't try to save me." He knew the big Indian had a knowledge of the country like nobody he had ever met, and if anyone could save him from a snake bite, even one as lethal as the one Zebediah had suffered, it would be Joe. But this was his chance. This was his time. He tried to wriggle off the big man's back, but there was nothing left in his body to struggle with. He gave up knowing he would probably be dead before they reached the house. Cherokee Joe lowered him off his back and sat him against the fallen tree they had sat on earlier. He took a small flask from his pocket and pushed it to Zebediah's lips. "Just water and a few herbs, Razor, my friend. It will just ease the pain a while," Cherokee Joe said. He could feel Zebediah trying to fight against the bottle, and hushed him gently. "No need to fight it, friend. This isn't a cure. Just going to let you go nice and easy is all. Trust Cherokee Joe. It's all gonna be fine." Zebediah relaxed and felt the pungent liquid on his
Censored.
The pain in his body was wretched, but soon he could feel a calming glow from the herbal drink, and his eyes flickered in thanks before closing. Cherokee Joe sat beside Zebediah, holding him in his arms. Zebediah's head now resting on his.
Censored.
The big man was singing a song in a deep baritone. Through closed dying eyes, Zebediah couldn't make out any words, but could hear the sweet cadence, and in his head could see the colors spin and dance to the tune. He could see the house. It was fine and grand and lit by soft sunlight. The hills and forest around it glowed and swayed to the rhythm of the chant from Cherokee Joe. The sound of a whispering breeze swept through the hills and embraced him, as he felt himself rise up onto his feet and look at the door. There stood Mary. In her arms she held a smiling Joshua, and the pair of them were beaming with happiness as they saw him. He walked through the gate and up to the front door and swept them both into his arms. Strong arms. Arms that were no longer scarred and torn, and his leg too felt like it could walk forever. Together they entered the house, and inside in the sitting room were his family and friends. They cheered and clapped as he came through the door. The room was loaded with food and drinks, and as they all raised a glass toward Zebediah, his mother stepped forward and embraced him. "Welcome home, Zebediah, my son. This is a real homecoming for you." Zebediah settled into a chair at the table and took the proffered glass from his father. He raised it up to the room full of people. "Here's to you all," he shouted happily. Then he turned to Mary, who was stood beside the chair he was in. "And here's to Mary. A love so strong it defies death. I love you, darling, with all my heart." Zebediah looked towards the door and moved from his chair. "Something wrong, Zeb?" Mary asked. "Joe is outside, waiting for me. I should say goodbye, I think," Zebediah said. "Joe will be joining us soon enough, my darling. He belongs with his own kind now. He has done all he can for you and understands." Mary replied,
Censored.
Zebediah on the forehead, and guiding him back to his seat. Chapter 12. Cherokee Joe picked up the now still body of Zebediah. He walked down towards the creek, and followed the edge to the old sycamore tree. He had spent some time, while Zebediah had been painfully walking down the track, to dig a hole in which he now lowered the body of Zebediah Resnake into. The grave he had dug lay between the two that were already there. Zebediah now slept soundly between his mother and his young wife and baby. Cherokee Joe stood back and rested on the shovel he had left by the grave. He took himself a drink and slowly began to fill the hole. Patiently, he wandered around the edge of the creek to collect a pile of stones he would cover the newly filled grave with. He worked through the night, and the sun was trying to climb over the mountains as he laid the last rock. He stood back to admire his handiwork. It looked well, he thought, and the family looked comfortable together under the large old sycamore tree. The view from there would be spectacular, and would change colors as the seasons came and went. They would all find peace here. His work here was done. Cherokee Joe made his way back along the creek, and up to the burned-out ruins. He rested a while, and was sure he could hear the sounds of laughter and partying from where the sitting room would have been. He smiled as he set off down the track to town. On the way down he met the copperhead snake, curled up in the undergrowth, waiting for the sun to warm its body and allow it to bask in its rays. Cherokee Joe reached into a pocket and pulled out a large rat. He placed it down on the track in front of the snake. "I appreciate your efforts. My friend does too. You made his journey much easier for him, and we thank you. Please accept this gift. I know you gave all you had last night, and will be hungry for it." Cherokee Joe said, "You did well, my son. I am proud of you. Walking with the dead is no easy task. Now return to your own people. You will receive a homecoming too," a voice behind him said. He turned to see his long-dead father smile at him, as he faded into nothing. He had a long trip home now, and the day was new. Cherokee Joe made his way down to the main road, and headed back to North Carolina. Extended epilogue, Daddy's Home. Zeb watched as his wife ran through the fields of wildflowers lit by the afternoon sunlight, and laughed. The beauty of her still took his breath away. Joshua, his son, rested beside him, his little face covered by a soft blanket his wife had sewn by hand. This really was heaven. Zeb remembered all of the things that had happened to him in those last months of his life, the things that came before, and knew that he was dead now. He didn't know if this really was heaven because he'd yet to meet a godhead or anything like an angel, but he knew they all existed, that the days kind of blended into one, and that happiness and contentment were the general order of the day. Maybe this was the real afterlife, perhaps heaven really was what you made of it. He saw no clouds, no pearly gates, no giant old men sitting in judgment, only his family and friends that had passed on, populating this new realm with him. As he relaxed back onto the blanket beneath him, Zeb watched Mary playing in the flowers, chasing a bee that seemed quite determined to get away from her. That was putting the shoe on the other foot, if he'd ever seen it. She danced around in a loose white dress that came down to her calves, her skin a golden hue. Her black hair bloomed out around her, twisting and turning as she moved amongst the flowers. She was all things good and loving. He knew what had happened to cause her death, the death of their son and the death of his mother. An accident pure and simple. Even his mother had told her so, but he knew it had weighed on her mind. That's why she'd still been there when he came home from the war. War did not exist here, not that he knew of, but he had no radio or television here, there was only word of mouth. Even that spread only happy news. Everything was right here, and he loved it. His decision had been made easily when he'd been bitten by that snake. Stay and endure loneliness and days full of emotional, mental, and physical pain, or let it all go. Cherokee Joe had been there to comfort him at the end, and the sweet memory almost brought a tear to Zeb's eye. "Son, I think you should go enjoy some time with that wife of yours. I'll watch Josh." Zeb looked up to see his mother smiling down at him, the oak tree over her head shading them all. "I think you're right, Mama. Thanks." He
censored
her hand as he sat up and rushed off to chase Mary in the field. They didn't age here, which was probably not a great thing for Joshua, but that was the reality. There was also no sickness, no hunger, though you could eat, and no pain. It truly was paradise, so maybe it was heaven? Zeb didn't know, nor did he care, as he caught his wife around her waist. "I so love you, Zeb." Mary breathed against his lips, stirring his
censored
immediately. She'd always been a seductive little temptress. "I love you, Mary. For eternity." He pulled her more tightly to his body, preparing to
censored
those tempting lips of hers, but she giggled and danced away, her lithe limbs carrying her like a deer through the field. She ran in the direction of the creek, heading for the cool water, for the place where she'd take that white cotton dress off and show him her perfect
censored
body. Zeb ran on able limbs, the limp gone that had so plagued him. His once scarred arms were now as smooth as the day he'd met Mary, and his body and mind were strong. Some of that was because of Mary's love. She had carried him through his time at war, and she had defied the grave to carry him through his painful homecoming. Now they carried each other through death, they made paradise worthwhile. She'd slipped out of her dress and into the cold water by the time Zeb caught up with her, and stripped off his own clothes. She swam like a fish, her round bottom flashing occasionally as she dove into the deeper parts of the water.
This scene has been censored to provide a safe and enjoyable reading experience for everyone.
He knew no other woman could ever make him feel like this, that no other woman could suck out his soul and give it back to him the way she did. He didn't want it any other way. "Zeb?" Her voice came softly from his side. "Yes, darling?" He turned to her, looking down into her sweet eyes. "Do you think this will ever end?" They'd never talked about their new reality, or about how long it might last. His eyes flicked away for a moment, giving away his fear that her words might jinx them. "I don't know, Mary. I don't want it to ever end. I guess we'll just have to live each day as though it's the last we'll ever have, won't we? Just in case." He pulled her closer to him, her leg going over his thigh. "I reckon you're right. I don't want it to end, I really don't. I do wonder if it will, though. It frightens me, the thought that this could all end and there may be nothing after. Because this is heaven, isn't it? There could be no better place, this is it. Our life right here is the ultimate." She looked at him intensely, and he knew she felt the same as him. It is heaven, Mary. Whether it's the version people think of or not, this is really heaven. Where you are, though, that's heaven for me. So in this reality or another, I promise I will be there with you, one way or another. I'll always find you, baby, and we'll make even the most hellish place our own little slice of heaven. Mary cuddled into his arms, content at last. So was Zeb. Thank you for reading my book. If you like this story, I think you'll enjoy my book. Get your copy of Sold to the Werewolf now. Please leave a review if you like this book. That's the best thing you can do to help authors like me, so others can find my books. It can be as long or as short as you'd like. Even a star rating is amazing and appreciated. Thanks in advance. About Summer Cooper. Thank you so much for reading. Without you, it wouldn't be possible for me to be a full-time author. I hope you enjoy reading my books as much as I do writing them. Besides, obviously, reading and writing, I also love cuddling my dogs, shouting at Alexa, being upside down, aka yoga, and driving my family cray-cray. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Goodreads, BookBub. Get in touch at hello@summercooper.com. www.summercooper.com. Closing credits. This has been Daddy's Home. Written by Summer Cooper. Auto-narrated using Google technology. Copyright 2024 by Lovie Books Limited. Production copyright 2024 by Lovie Books Limited.